Orson Vickery leaned across his counter and let his eyes drag slowly up and down Elowen Pike's body. The kind of look designed to make a person feel like something stuck to the bottom of a boot. "You again," his voice carried across the whole store. Two men near the back stopped what they were doing. "Tell me, girl, how much flour does it actually take to keep all of that moving through the winter?" He laughed. They laughed. Elowen set her bundle of pelts on the counter, didn't look at him, didn't answer. "She's going to freeze up there," Orson said to the men, not even bothering to lower his voice. "First hard snow, she'll come waddling back down that mountain crying for help. Mark my words." She took her flour, she took her salt, she walked out the door. And not a single person in Coldwater Hollow could have imagined what she was walking back to. If you've ever been written off by someone who should have known better, this story is for you. Subscribe and stay with me until the very end, because what happens in the final chapter is something I still can't stop thinking about. Hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The orphan house matron didn't even invite her inside. That was the part Elowen Pike remembered most clearly, even a full year later. Not the walk down from the ridge in the cold. Not the way her boots had worn through at the left heel and rubbed a raw strip of skin all the way up her Achilles. Not even the smell of the place. Wood smoke, boiled cabbage, something damp underneath it all. What she remembered was standing on the porch, 17 years old, with everything she owned rolled into a canvas pack on her back, and the matron, a thin, severe woman named Mrs. Aldridge, looking at her the way a person looks at a problem they don't want to solve. "We're full," Mrs. Aldridge said. Elowen waited. There was usually a but, a however. Some kind of next sentence that turned the first one into something manageable. There wasn't one. "The rooms are at capacity." Mrs. Aldridge pulled her shawl tighter. "I'm sorry, but there's nothing I can do." Elowen looked past her into the hallway. Through the narrow gap in the door, she could see a boy of maybe 9 sitting at a table doing something with a piece of string. He was the only person visible. The hallway behind him looked empty enough to swallow sound. She didn't say anything about that. She didn't argue. She had learned early that arguing with people who had already decided something was a particular kind of exhausting that didn't pay for itself. "All right," she said. She turned around and walked back down the porch steps. She walked back through Coldwater Hollow with the canvas pack cutting into her shoulder and her ruined boot chewing at her heel. Past the blacksmith. Past the general store where a woman in a good coat stopped talking to her friend long enough to look at Elowen the way you look at weather you don't want to get caught in. Past the church and the mill and the small cluster of houses at the north end of town, where children were playing some kind of chasing game in the mud. Nobody stopped her. Nobody asked where she was going. That was the thing about being the size Elowen was, and she had known this for years, had carried it as its own kind of knowledge. People either stared or they looked through you entirely. There wasn't much in between. The ones who stared were at least honest about it. The ones who looked through you were telling you something too, something they maybe didn't even know they were saying. They were telling you that you didn't quite register as a full category of person who might need something or be going somewhere or have reasons for the things you did. She walked north through town and then up, along the trail that got less like a trail the higher she climbed, until the settlement below her was just smoke and the distant sound of hammering, and then nothing at all. The cave entrance was a crack in the rock face that a person of average size might have squeezed through without thinking much of it. For Elowen, it had taken 3 careful attempts on her first day to figure out the exact angle that worked. After that, it was just a motion, like a key in a lock. Sideways, left shoulder forward, chin tucked. She could do it with her arms full now. Inside the cave was dark in the way caves are dark. Not the dark of a room with curtains drawn, but something older, with a weight to it. She had learned to move in it without a torch in the first week, to know the shape of the place through her feet and her hands, to trust the sound of water in the back chamber as a kind of compass. Bracken was already up off the floor before she was fully inside. The dog was lean and gray, built low to the ground with a long head and ears that could catch a sound from the next valley over. He pressed his nose against her hand and then her hip, and then he stood there with his tail making one slow arc back and forth, reading her. "I know," she said. She set the pack down against the wall where the floor was flattest. Her shoulder ached. She rolled it in the socket and felt something pop in a way that wasn't quite painful but wasn't quite right either, That particular category of feeling that a body develops after enough weight and repetition. She sat down on the low flat rock she used as a chair. She had found it wedged in the back chamber and dragged it out over the course of an afternoon, stopping to rest more times than she had wanted to. And she pulled off her boot and looked at her heel. It wasn't bad, a little raw. She had some salve in the pack, a small clay jar of it that she'd traded 2 rabbit skins for in September. She worked it into the skin with her thumb while Bracken put his long face in her lap and looked up at her with his pale eyes. "Orson Vickery," she said. The dog blinked. "He said I'd be waddling back down the mountain crying." She kept working the salve in. He said it loud enough so everyone could hear. Bracken made a sound in the back of his throat. Not quite a whine. "I know." She put the boot back on, wincing slightly. "Me too." What she'd learned, what you had to learn if you were going to survive it, was that the same people who underestimated you because of how you looked were often the people least prepared for what you could actually do. She had filed that lesson away somewhere useful and moved on. She was on her way to find Jonas when she heard the noise from the far end of the yard. It was a pen she wouldn't have noticed otherwise. It was shoved into the back corner near the loading chutes, away from the main auction area, and the animals inside it were so quiet and still that from 50 yards they barely registered as living things. She stopped walking and looked more carefully. 39 goats, penned together so tightly they could barely turn around. Every one of them thin in a way that went past poor condition into something that looked like surrender. Their ribs showed like the washboard sides of a slatted fence. Their coats were dull and patchy. A few were lying down in the middle of the afternoon heat and not getting up, which wasn't a good sign in any animal. The auctioneer, a long man named Fitch, who wore the same cracked leather vest every single auction and had the voice of a man who'd been shouting over crowds for 30 years, was standing next to the pen looking like he'd rather be anywhere else on earth. He'd started the bidding at $8 for the lot, then $6, then $4. Nobody moved. The yard had shifted its attention mostly away from the pen, the way people shift attention away from things that embarrass them. Elowen stood at the fence and looked at the goats. She thought about Crady's wheel of cheese. She thought about the thorn brush on her hillside that cattle wouldn't touch. She thought about the $260 note above the kitchen shelf. She thought about Pearl the milk cow and her declining production and the hay bill that kept climbing. She was still standing there thinking when Fitch dropped the price one more time. $3, he said, with the tone of a man reading a disappointing obituary. $3 for the lot. Somebody give these animals a purpose. Elowen raised her hand. The yard went sideways. She heard it before she fully processed it. That specific sound a crowd makes when something registers as funny. That chain reaction ripple of laughter that started near the front and spread backward through the men until it filled the whole dusty yard. Some of them were laughing at the goats. Some of them were laughing at the price. But most of them, and Elowen knew this with a clarity that came from long practice, were laughing at her. She kept her hand up. That was when Bramwell Rusk stepped forward. Bramwell was not a man who needed to be loud to be dangerous. He was already the biggest cattle operation in the valley, already the man whose opinion moved prices at every auction and whose disputes had a way of becoming other people's problems. But he was also, at his core, a man who enjoyed an audience, and the sight of a heavy young woman bidding $3 on 39 dying goats was exactly the kind of audience moment he loved best. "Somebody stop that woman before she wastes her own money," he called out, and his voice carried the easy confidence of a man accustomed to having his observations treated as entertainment. The men around him laughed harder. A few of them repeated it to the men behind them who hadn't heard clearly, making sure the joke spread as far as it could reach. Elowen looked at him. She didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that would land right in this yard, in front of these men, in this moment. She had learned that too. You didn't win arguments in public against men like Bramwell Rusk. You won them somewhere else over time, with evidence. And you had to be patient enough to wait for that evidence to exist before you said a word. Fitch looked slightly pained. $3, he repeated. I've got $3 from the... Do I have any other bids? He did not. Sold, Fitch said, and the gavel came down with a sound that Elowen felt somewhere between her sternum and her spine, and she exhaled slowly while the yard was still chuckling and started walking toward the pen. Jonas found her 90 seconds later. He looked at the goats, he looked at her face, He looked at the goats again. Elowen, he said, with the particular careful quiet of a man who understands that whatever question he is about to ask has already been decided. What are we doing? We're loading 39 goats, she said. We don't have a goat pen. We'll build one. He was quiet for a moment. She could see him doing the same arithmetic she'd done, running the numbers in his head the way he always did, looking for the gap between what they had and what this required. He was a practical man. That was both his strength and his limitation. I can fix the lower fence line by Tuesday, he finally said, if you tell me what it needs to be. That was Jonas Mercer. He didn't understand it yet. He might not understand it for weeks, but he was going to help her do it. That was who he was, underneath all the practical caution, underneath the worry he carried in the set of his shoulders. He was going to show up and do the work. She put her hand on his arm for just a moment, and then went to find Fitch to pay her $3. The thing about 39 starving goats is that getting them home is only the beginning of the problem. The real problem starts when you look at them in the morning light of your own property and understand exactly what you've taken on. Elowen stood at the edge of the lower fence line the next morning and took inventory. Not $3 worth of inventory. She forced herself past that framing immediately because it would make her soft about the decisions ahead. She inventoried them as an operation because that's what they were going to have to become if any of this was going to work. Of the 39, 7 were in bad enough shape that she had genuine concerns about whether they'd pull through the first week. 4 of those 7 were does, female animals, which meant they mattered more to her plan than the others because this whole idea lived or died on milk production. She spent the first morning focused entirely on those 4. Water first, always. Then small amounts of food. Too much too fast, and an animal already in distress could go the wrong direction fast. She'd learned that from watching Pearl go through a bad spring 3 years back. She made 4 trips to the root cellar for feed she'd planned to stretch through the winter. She didn't let herself calculate the cost. Not yet. Jonas spent the morning on fencing and didn't ask questions, which she appreciated more than she could have said. By afternoon, 2 of the 4 weak does were on their feet. 1 was still down. One check. A gray-sided animal with 1 slightly cloudy eye was somewhere between those 2 states, oscillating, and Elowen sat in the dirt next to her for 40 minutes, just keeping her company and watching her breathe, which wasn't something she could have explained rationally, but felt necessary in a way she trusted. The gray doe was on her feet by evening. Elowen allowed herself exactly 1 moment of relief and then went back inside to start writing down everything she knew about cheese. She did not know much. That was the first honest thing she wrote. She knew that her grandmother had made a simple fresh cheese from cow's milk when Elowen was a child, pressing it in cloth and salting it and storing it in the coolest part of the cellar. She knew the basic principle, acid or heat to separate the curds from the whey, pressure to drive out the moisture, salt, and time to build a rind that protected the interior. She knew almost nothing about the specific qualities of goat's milk, about aging temperatures, about how long a wheel needed to cure before it could be trusted to hold its character through a valley summer. What she had was Crady's voice in her head and a wheel of 6-week-old cheese that had tasted like something worth pursuing. And the arithmetic, always the arithmetic, the banknote, the winter timeline, the math of what they needed to produce to survive. She wrote down what she knew. Then she wrote down what she needed to learn. The second list was considerably longer than the first. Jonas read both lists over her shoulder without speaking and then said, "I can ride up to Creddy's on Saturday." She looked at him. "If you tell me what to ask," he added. "I'm going with you," she said. They rode up together on Saturday. Creddy answered every question she had, and several she hadn't thought to ask yet, and when they left, he pressed into her hands a folded piece of paper with notes in handwriting so cramped it took her 2 evenings to fully decipher. But it was all there, temperatures, timing, the particular way goat milk behaved differently than cow's milk during the separation process, and what to do about it. The importance of the salt crust in a hot, dry climate. How long a wheel needed before it would survive transport without losing its integrity. She read those notes until she had them memorized. Then she started. The first batch failed. Not catastrophically. It didn't spoil, it didn't grow anything alarming. It simply didn't set right. The curds broke wrong during pressing, and what came out was crumbly and inconsistent, something no freight merchant would pay money for and no family would want twice. She wrote down exactly what had gone wrong, everything she'd done in sequence. Every temperature she'd estimated, every moment she thought she might have rushed. Then she started again. The second batch was better in some ways and worse in others. The set was more consistent, but the rind wasn't forming the way Creddy's notes described. And without a proper rind, the wheel wasn't going to age correctly, wasn't going to survive the kind of heat that sat over Ravenridge Valley from late June through August, like a physical weight pressing down on everything below it. She stared at the second batch for a long time. Then she adjusted three things: the salt concentration, the pressing time, the location in the cellar where she was letting it cure, and started the third batch. While she was working through the cheese, the goats were working through the hillside. That was the thing nobody watching from the road would have understood, and nobody driving past the Mercer property on the upper track bothered to look closely enough to see. The hillside that every cattleman in the valley had written off as useless was not useless. It was loaded with exactly what it had always been loaded with: thornbrush and blackberry cane and scrub oak and sumac, spreading unchecked because cattle wouldn't touch it, and the Mercers hadn't had the labor to clear it. The goats didn't see any of that as a problem. They saw it as dinner. Day by day, the animals worked their way across the lower slope and then up toward the ridge. Their coats started filling in. Their ribs began to disappear under returning muscle. They moved differently, with more purpose, more energy. And Elowen watched them the way you watch something that is deciding whether it wants to live, and she kept her own counsel about what she saw. By week 3, the 7 animals she'd been most worried about were all on their feet and eating normally. By week 4, she was seeing the first real signs of what their milk production might eventually become. Not there yet. Not close to what she needed. But trending in the right direction, and in Elowen Mercer's experience, something trending in the right direction was worth more than something standing still that everyone agreed was adequate. The third batch of cheese came out right. Not perfect. She knew enough to know that perfect wasn't the goal. Consistent was the goal. Reliable was the goal. Something a freight merchant could put in a wagon and drive 40 miles over rough road and deliver to a customer who'd then put it in their cellar for another 3 weeks and still find it worth eating when they finally cut into it. Fancy wasn't the market. Survival was the market. She was making food for a drought-stricken valley, not impressing a hotel dining room. The wheel sat on the cedar shelf she'd made Jonas install in the coolest corner of the root cellar, and she visited it every morning the way you might visit something you'd invested more than money in. She pressed it lightly to check the rind. She noted the color. She marked the date on the side with a grease pencil. Meanwhile, the valley was still laughing. She heard it secondhand, from the feed merchant's wife, who told her with the careful sympathy of someone who thought she was being kind. From a neighbor woman who stopped on the road to ask how those goats are coming along, in a tone that suggested she expected the answer to be poorly. She heard that Bramwell Rusk had told the story of the auction at least twice at the Ravenridge Inn, adding details each time, making it funnier with each retelling. The heavy girl who bought dead goats for pocket change and thought she was going to save her farm with it. Hilarious. Embarrassing. The kind of story that made men feel better about their own situations by comparison. Jonas heard some of it too. He came home one evening in the 3rd week with his jaw set at an angle that meant he'd heard something he didn't like, and he sat down at the table without speaking, and Elowen put food in front of him and waited. "Rusk was in the feed store," Jonas finally said. "I know. He told Ferris that we'd be at the bank by November." He paused. "That the note would take us." Elowen sat down across from him. "He might be right," she said, "if the cheese doesn't work." Jonas looked at her. "You think it won't?" "I think the 3rd batch looks better than the 2nd, she said. "And I think these goats are going to start milking properly in the next 3 to 4 weeks. And I think if I can get 5 or 6 weeks on a wheel that sets right, I might have something worth taking to Tobias Creed." She watched Jonas process that. She could see him doing the math, running the timeline, checking it against the bank deadline, the way a carpenter checks a measurement twice before cutting. He was quiet long enough that she started to wonder what he was going to say. "You need more cedar shelves," he said finally. "In the cellar. You're going to need the room." She hadn't expected that. Something shifted in her chest, not dramatically, not with any kind of ceremony, just a quiet settling, like a beam finding its proper load. "Tuesday," she said. "If you can do it Tuesday, that gives me time to rearrange the storage before the next batch is ready for the rack." "Tuesday," he said, and went back to eating. Outside, across the rocky hillside that everyone in Ravenridge agreed was worthless, 39 formerly dying goats were settling into the night. Their bells made a small, irregular music in the dark. Nothing magical, nothing cinematic, just animals that had been given a place to be, eating what the land offered, getting stronger day by day, not knowing and not needing to know that everything depended on them. Elowen cleared the table and went back to her notebook and started planning what she was going to say to Tobias Creed. Tobias Creed was not a man who wasted time on pleasantries, and he was not a man who wasted money on sentiment. He had been running freight contracts across 3 counties for 22 years, which meant he had developed the particular kind of vision that comes from watching other people's businesses succeed and fail from the outside. He knew what held and what didn't, what traveled and what didn't, what a valley full of struggling families actually needed versus what they thought they needed. He was also, as everyone in Ravenridge knew, the single most important commercial relationship a small producer could have, because Tobias Creed's wagons went places that small producers couldn't reach on their own, and his word to buyers down the line meant the difference between a product with a market and a product sitting in a cellar going nowhere. Elowen had met him exactly once before, at a county fair 3 years ago, where Jonas had tried to discuss the possibility of shipping surplus preserved goods. Tobias had been polite and brief and entirely uninterested, because what the Mercers had at that time was a modest surplus of preserved vegetables and pickled goods that half the valley was already producing. Nothing distinctive. Nothing that solved a problem he didn't already have a solution for. She thought about that conversation on the morning she loaded the first wheel into the back of the wagon. 6.5 weeks old. The rind had set properly, firm and dry, with the pale gold color Cready's notes had described as the right marker for a wheel that would hold its character through transport and extended storage. She'd cut a thin test wedge the night before and tasted it, and then made Jonas taste it and watched his face carefully. He'd chewed slowly and said nothing for a moment, and then said, "That's something," which from Jonas was approximately equivalent to another man standing up and cheering. She wrapped it in cloth and placed it carefully in the wagon bed and drove into town alone. Tobias Creed's freight office was on the main road, a long building with wagon bays along the south side and a small room at the front that served as his working space. He was at his desk when she came in, and he looked up with the expression of a man whose time is genuinely limited and who needs a reason to give any of it away. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, because he was a man who remembered names even when he didn't remember conversations. "Mr. Creed." She set the cloth-wrapped wheel on the edge of his desk. "I'd like you to taste something." He looked at the wheel. He looked at her. "I'm in the middle of—" "It'll take 3 minutes," she said. "Less if the answer is no." Something in how she said it, the flatness of it, the absence of apology, made him pause. He reached over and unwrapped the cloth himself, and the smell hit the room immediately, that particular aged goat cheese smell that was sharp and earthy and specific in a way that either caught your attention or didn't. It caught his. He didn't ask for a knife. He had one on the desk. He cut a wedge himself and ate it without ceremony, the way a man eats when he's assessing rather than enjoying, chewing slowly with his eyes on the middle distance, running it through whatever internal system he'd built over 22 years of moving food across a difficult landscape. The silence stretched long enough that Elowen's heartbeat became something she was aware of. "What's the water content at this age?" he asked. "Low enough to ship without wax in dry weather," she said. "It won't sweat until you get above 90 degrees ambient for more than 6 hours straight." "And the shelf life at destination, if a buyer puts it in a cool cellar?" "Another 4 to 6 weeks minimum. Longer if the cellar is genuinely cool. I've had a test wheel in my root cellar for 9 weeks now, and it's still tightening, not softening." He cut another piece, ate it, set the knife down. "What are you producing right now?" "Currently 3 wheels to a batch, batches every 12 days as the herd's milk volume builds. In 6 weeks, I expect to be at 5 to 6 wheels per batch. By late fall, if the herd continues on its current trajectory, I'm looking at 8 to 10 wheels every 10 days. Tobias Creed looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something. "You bought those goats at Fitch's auction," he said. "The ones from the back pen." "Yes." "Rusk's been telling that story all over town." "I know." "He thinks you're going broke by November." "I know that too." He picked up the remainder of the wedge he'd cut and held it for a moment, turning it slightly. Here's my problem, Mrs. Mercer. I've got buyers in Callaway and up in the Prescott Junction who've been asking me for months for a cheese that can make a 40-mile wagon ride in July without arriving as a puddle. What I've been sending them is a soft wheel from the Hartley Dairy that makes it maybe half the time and disappoints them the other half. He put the cheese down. If you can deliver what you're describing on a reliable schedule, I'm interested. Define interested, she said, because she had learned that interested without specifics was just politeness with commercial packaging. He almost smiled. I'll take everything you have from this batch. And if the next 2 batches hold to this standard, we talk about a standing arrangement. Price, she said. He named a number. It was reasonable. It was not what she needed. That gets me through the banknote, she said. It doesn't get me through expansion. I need to expand to meet the volume you're describing. He looked at her steadily. What do you need per wheel? She told him. He was quiet for a moment, and then he moved the number up by enough that the arithmetic shifted, not dramatically but meaningfully. The way a single degree of angle changes everything about where a rifle shot lands. But I need consistency, he said. Same quality, same cure time, same weight. I can't be sending buyers a different product every other month. You won't be, she said, and she said it without hesitation because she'd been testing this product for 8 weeks and she knew what she was making. She drove home with an empty wagon bed and enough money from that first wheel to buy 2 months of feed and still have something left for the root cellar board she'd been putting off. It wasn't enough to touch the banknote. It wasn't close to enough for that. But it was proof that the thing she'd been building in her head was an actual thing in the actual world. And that mattered in a way that was harder to quantify than dollars, but just as real. Jonas was at the fence when she got back. He'd been repairing the middle pasture section, a stretch that needed new posts every winter and always got put off until it became a genuine emergency. He stopped working when he saw her face and read it the way people read faces when the stakes are high enough that words feel insufficient. He bought it? Jonas said. He bought it, and he wants the next 2 batches. Jonas held his fence tool loosely at his side. She could see him running the numbers the same way she'd run them in the wagon on the way home. That's not enough for the note, he said. Not as a criticism, as a statement of fact that needed to be in the room with them. Not yet, she said, but it's enough to keep going. And if I can get to 8 wheels a batch before November, that's a big if, Elowen. I know. She didn't argue with him. She agreed with him. It was a big if. Most of the things she'd staked their situation on over the past 2 months were big ifs, and the only reason they hadn't crushed her was that she'd learned to treat uncertainty as a condition of the work rather than a verdict on it. You didn't know if the batch would set right until it set. You didn't know if the does would milk heavily until they did. You made your best decision with what you had, and you kept your hands moving. The gray doe, she said instead, the one with the cloudy eye. She's been the heaviest producer in the herd for the last 12 days. I want to breed her priority this fall. Jonas looked at her. You're already thinking about next year. I'm always thinking about next year, she said. That's the only way you get there. He went back to his fence work. She went back to her cellar. The next 4 weeks had a quality that Elowen would only be able to describe clearly afterward, a kind of grinding momentum, like a heavy wheel that took tremendous effort to start rolling and then developed its own insistence. Every morning she was up before the light, not because she set herself to it, but because her mind came awake already moving, already running through the day's list before her body had fully agreed to participate. The does needed milking at consistent times, because inconsistent milking schedules disrupted production, and she could not afford disruption. The milk needed to be processed within a specific window, or the initial bacteria counts went wrong and the whole batch was compromised. The wheels on the aging rack needed to be turned and checked, and the cellar temperature needed to be monitored with the obsessive attention of someone who knows that the difference between a good wheel and a ruined one can be a matter of 10 degrees sustained over 2 days. She kept a logbook, not a casual one, a rigorous one, the kind where every variable got recorded because she was still learning what mattered and what didn't, and the only way to find out was to track everything until the patterns became clear. Date of batch, milk volume, separation temperature, press time and weight, salt application, rind condition at day 7, 14:21. Any anomaly, however small. The logbook was also, she understood, something else. It was evidence. If it ever came to proving what she'd built, to a banker, to a buyer, to anyone who doubted what this operation was capable of, the logbook was the argument she couldn't make with words. She did not share this reasoning with Jonas. He would have understood it, but saying it out loud would have meant saying the quiet thing they were both holding. That the banknote was coming and the timeline was brutal and they were not there yet. They both knew it. They worked around it the way you work around a physical object in the center of a room that neither of you wants to acknowledge. The herd continued to improve. That was the thing that kept her grounded when the anxiety spiked in the middle of the night. The goats were doing what Creddy had promised they would do. They were eating the hillside brush that had been useless for years and converting it into something the operation needed. Their milk volume was climbing in the gradual, consistent way that meant genuine recovery rather than a temporary surge that would drop back. She was tracking that in the logbook too. Daily milk weight per animal, watching the curve build. The fourth batch came out with a consistency that made her sit down in the cellar for a moment and just breathe. Not from relief. From something more complicated than relief. The specific feeling of watching a thing you designed in your head become real in your hands, which is one of the better feelings available to a person and also one of the rarer ones. She took 2 wheels to Tobias Creed in the 3rd week of August. He had them on his desk for 4 minutes before he said, "I want to talk about the arrangement." The arrangement he was proposing was more than she'd expected. He wanted a guaranteed allocation through the end of the year, as many wheels as she could reliably produce, minimum 6 per delivery every 2 weeks. He had, he told her, already spoken to 2 buyers in Callaway who were willing to commit to regular purchases once they'd received the first shipment and confirmed the quality. One of them was a dry goods provisioner who supplied general stores across a 40-mile radius. The other was a hotel kitchen manager who had been looking for a shelf-stable cheese for months. "What happened to the Hartley dairy cheese?" she asked. Tobias made a small expression that wasn't quite a smile. The last wagon delivery arrived soft. Hotel manager was not pleased. She did not allow herself to feel satisfaction about this. There was nothing to feel satisfied about in another dairy operation's trouble. The Hartleys were a family just like the Mercers, doing their best in a hard landscape. What she allowed herself to feel was a precise professional recognition that the market Tobias was describing was real, and that she was currently the best positioned person in the valley to serve it. "I need something from you in return," she said. He waited. "I need you to tell your buyers this product comes from the Mercer operation in Ravenridge Valley. Not just goat cheese, Mercer goat cheese. Because when I scale this up, I need them to be buying from me specifically, not just buying a type of product that someone else can undercut." Tobias looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You're thinking about competition already." "I'm thinking about Bramwell Rusk," she said. "He's going to notice eventually, and when he does, he's going to want in. And if he gets in, he has more capital, more land, and more relationships than I do. The only protection I have is being first and being known." She paused. "So yes, I need my name on the product." "Done," he said simply, and she believed him because Tobias Creed was a man whose commercial interests aligned with hers on this point. A named, reliable producer was worth more to him than an interchangeable commodity. She drove home running numbers the entire way. If she could hold 6 wheels per delivery at the price they'd agreed, and if the herd continued building toward the volume she projected, and if the 4th and 5th batches held to the quality of the 3rd and 4th, the math was becoming something that almost resembled possible. Not certain, not safe. But possible in a way it hadn't been 60 days ago when 39 dying goats were standing in the dust of the Mercer lower pasture, and Jonas was quietly terrified, and she was turning it all over in her head and keeping it there because she didn't have the language for it yet. The following Tuesday, something shifted. She was in the cellar doing her morning check when she heard Jonas talking to someone outside. Not the easy talk of a neighbor stopping by. The careful, slightly flat tone he used when the conversation was one he was monitoring. She listened for a moment and then went outside. The man standing in the yard was not someone she recognized immediately. He was perhaps 60, weathered in the particular way of men who work outdoors in mountain climates, wearing a decent coat that was cut for a man with a different kind of money than most people in Ravenridge had. He had a horse that was worth noticing too. Not flashy, but the kind of well-maintained animal you kept when you had the resources to keep it properly. Jonas said, This is Mr. Aldwick. He says he's up from Callaway. The man nodded at her. Mrs. Mercer, I'm the provisioner Tobias Creed mentioned. I was passing through on other business, and Creed suggested I stop. He paused. He said I should see the operation. Elowen looked at him for a moment, then at Jonas, then back at him. What did you want to see specifically? The goats, the cellar, how you're aging the wheels. He said it directly, without apology. I don't buy from producers I haven't visited. Too many people can describe a process they're not actually running. She considered him for 3 seconds. Then she said, Come on, and led him toward the upper pasture. She showed him everything, not because she felt she had to, because she wanted him to understand what he was looking at. The goats on the hillside, working through the brush with their systematic efficiency. The milk room Jonas had helped her build inside the barn, simple and clean, with the temperature management system she'd worked out over 6 weeks of adjustment. The root cellar with its cedar shelves and the rows of wheels at various stages of aging. The newest batch white and soft-rinded. The older ones gold and firm, each one marked with its date in grease pencil. Aldwick crouched in front of the shelving and looked at the wheels with the focus of a man who knew something about what he was examining. How many do you have at 6 weeks or older right now? 7 wheels ready for delivery next week. 3 more at 5 weeks that'll be ready the week after. And next month? I'm projecting 8 to 10 wheels per batch by the end of September. He stood up slowly, the way men of 60 stand up from crouching. He looked at the shelves a moment longer, then turned to face her. Creed's price is fair. I'll take 6 wheels from next week's delivery and standing orders through December. But I want to pay you direct, not through Creed's arrangement. Full price, minus a transportation fee to his freight. Elowen felt the number reconfigure in her head. Direct sales at full price, even with the freight cut, were better than selling wholesale to Tobias. The difference per wheel wasn't dramatic, but across a season, it added up to something meaningful. My name on the invoice, she said. Mercer Operation, Ravenridge Valley. Obviously, he said, with a faint expression that suggested he found the stipulation reasonable to the point of being self-evident. I'm buying your product, not a type of product. He left 20 minutes later, and Elowen stood in the yard watching him ride back down the track, and did not allow herself to celebrate because celebration was a thing she'd decided to postpone until the banknote was paid and not one day before. But she let herself notice that something was working, not because she'd gotten lucky, not because the market had been kind to her, because she had looked at a rocky hillside and a pen of dying goats and asked a different question than everyone else was asking, and then she'd done the work of proving the answer. That evening, Jonas came in from the pasture and sat down at the table with dirt on his hands and fatigue in every line of his face, and he looked at the ledger she'd been updating for the last hour and said, Tell me where we are. She turned the ledger around and let him read it. He was quiet for a long time. She watched him track through the columns, the milk production figures, the batch records, the sales from Tobias's arrangement, the projection for Aldwick's direct order, the running balance against the banknote. We're not there yet, he said. No. But we're closer than I thought we'd be. Yes. He pushed the ledger back across the table and rubbed his face with both hands. We need more cedar boards. For the aging shelves. What you've got isn't going to be enough by October. I know. I was going to ask you about that. I'll get them Thursday, he said. And then, after a pause that had some weight in it, Elowen, what you've built here, in 2 months. He stopped. He was not a man who found certain kinds of words easy, and she had long since stopped expecting him to find them. I didn't see it, he said finally, at the auction, when you raised your hand. I didn't see what you saw. You came and helped load the goats, she said. That was enough. It wasn't enough, he said. But I'm trying. She looked at him across the table, this man who worked himself down to the bone every day and worried in the private, compressed way of a man who believes worrying is something you carry alone, and who had followed her into something he didn't understand because he trusted her even when he couldn't explain why. He was not perfect. He was not the kind of husband who appeared in the stories women told each other about good men, eloquent and perceptive and full of the right words at the right moments. He was tired and calloused and sometimes stubborn and occasionally wrong about things in ways that cost them time. But he was here. He had always been here. And some nights that was the most important thing in the world. "Get the cedar boards," she said. "I'm going to need them." The problem came from a direction she hadn't fully anticipated, which was typical of problems. The ones that hurt most were rarely the ones you'd been watching. She'd been watching the banknote. She'd been watching the milk production curve and the batch schedule and the aging timeline. She'd been watching her relationship with Tobias Creed and monitoring the early signals from Aldwych. What she had not been watching carefully enough was Bramwell Rusk. This was partly her own fault. She'd known he was watching her. The story he'd been telling at the Ravenridge Inn made its way back to her in pieces, accumulating detail each time, which meant he was retelling it regularly, which meant she was in his mind more than she'd expected. But she'd been so focused on production that she'd allowed herself to frame Rusk as a background threat rather than an active one. He was wealthy and influential and petty in the way that only the powerful could be petty. She knew that. She had simply underestimated how quickly his pettiness could translate into action. The first sign was indirect. The feed merchant, a patient man named Dunner, who had always treated her fairly, mentioned in passing during her Thursday purchase that he'd had a conversation with someone from Rusk's operation about her account. Not threatening, just a conversation. Just somebody asking questions about how much she was buying, how often, whether she'd been current on her payments. She paid Dunner and drove home and sat in the kitchen for 15 minutes, thinking about what questions like that meant. They meant Rusk was gathering information, which meant he'd moved past amusement and into something else. She wrote it down in a separate section of her logbook that she'd started keeping for things that weren't production records. Conversations, observations, anything that seemed like it might be a piece of a pattern she couldn't see clearly yet. She wrote down the date, what Dunner had said, the tone of it. She didn't say anything to Jonas about it yet because she wasn't sure what she was looking at, and she didn't want to spend his worry on something she couldn't define. The second sign came 10 days later, from an unexpected source. There was a woman in Ravenridge named Hattie Dunmore who served on the county agricultural board and who had spent 20 years being casually dismissed by the men around her in the way that women who know more than the men around them often are. She and Elowen were not close exactly. They were more like two people who recognized something in each other without having had the time or occasion to act on it. Hattie stopped Elowen on the one afternoon and said, with the directness of a woman who had long since run out of patience for the indirect approach, "I'm going to tell you something, and I'd appreciate it if you didn't make a thing out of how I know it." "All right," Elowen said. "Rusk has been talking to Harlan Price at the bank." She paused. "About your note." Elowen held very still. "About what specifically?" "About whether there are provisions in the note that would allow for acceleration, calling it earlier than the written deadline." Hattie watched her face carefully. "I don't know if it's possible. I just know the conversation happened." Elowen thanked her and drove home at a pace that felt too slow for what was moving through her chest. She pulled out the banknote that evening, the actual document, which she'd read so many times she could recite most of it, but which she now read again from the first word to the last with the specific attention of someone looking for a trap they might have missed. She read every clause, every condition, every provision regarding default, security, and there. A paragraph she'd registered before but hadn't flagged as dangerous because she hadn't imagined someone would have both the motivation and the relationship to use it. A provision allowing the bank to accelerate the note in cases where the collateral, meaning the property, was subject to unresolved legal encumbrance. She read it 3 times. Then she sat back and understood what Rusk was building. He didn't need to beat her in the market. He didn't need to outproduce her or undercut her price. He just needed to create a legal question about something attached to the Mercer property. Anything, it didn't matter what, as long as it was unresolved when he needed it to be. And then take that question to Harlan Price, who would have both the authority and the motivation, if Rusk wanted him to use it, to call the note early. She looked at what she had. Property records, water rights, land survey, everything she'd filed and registered when they bought the land. She went through all of it that night at the kitchen table, Jonas asleep down the hall, the lantern burning low. She found the spring documentation at 2 in the morning. The original survey notes from 17 years ago when the property had changed hands, with a notation about a cattle passage easement that ran through the lower corner of the property. The easement concerned grazing access, not water rights. The spring itself was unambiguously part of the Mercer parcel, documented in the deed. But the easement notation was imprecise enough. In the language of a surveyor who'd been working quickly on a long day, that someone looking for ambiguity could find it. She already knew Rusk was someone looking for ambiguity. She put the documents in a separate folder and laid them on the table where she would see them in the morning. Then she sat for a moment in the dark kitchen with the logbook open in front of her and the ledger next to it and the banknote on top of everything. And she thought about what it meant that a man as powerful as Bramwell Rusk had decided that a woman with 39 goats and a root cellar full of cheese was enough of a threat to be worth destroying. She thought about it for a while. Then she picked up her pen and made a note in the logbook. She wrote, "Rusk is scared. Scared people make mistakes." She closed the book and went to bed. The morning brought no resolution and no clarity, just work that needed doing regardless. The does needed milking, the current batch needed turning, the cellar temperature had dropped 2 degrees overnight and needed monitoring. She moved through the morning routine the way she'd been moving through it for weeks, with the focused efficiency of someone who has reduced the distance between thought and action to almost nothing, and while her hands did their work, her mind stayed on the problem. She needed to do 2 things. She needed to resolve the legal ambiguity about the easement before Rusk could use it, and she needed to do it in a way that was bulletproof enough that even Harlan Price, who was not an independent man when it came to Bramwell Rusk, couldn't find a reason to call the note. That meant a lawyer, which meant money she hadn't planned on spending, which meant pressure on a budget that was already running close. She told Jonas at lunch. He took it in the way he took most difficult information, quietly, processing it in private before he said anything. She gave him the full picture, the conversation Hattie had reported, the provision in the note, the easement notation in the survey, what she thought Rusk was likely trying to do, and why. When she finished, Jonas said, "How much does a lawyer cost?" "I don't know yet. I need to go to Callaway to find one who isn't connected to Rusk's business interests." "When do you need to go?" "Soon. Before he files anything, if he's planning to file. Once there's an active claim on record, it's harder to resolve quickly." Jonas put his fork down. "Can you go Thursday? I can manage the morning milking. I've watched you do it enough." She looked at him. He had never offered to manage the milking before. He'd helped with fence and construction and feed and a dozen other things. But the dairy management had been entirely hers, and she'd been protective of it in the same way you're protective of the thing that carries the most weight. You don't let someone else hold it until you're certain they can. "The timing for the morning milk," she started. "I know," he said. 5 o'clock, same 2 does first, because they're the heaviest producers, and if you start with the light ones, they get competitive and you get inconsistent volumes. Clean the equipment before and after. Don't rush the second milking on the gray dough because she holds back if she feels hurried. He paused. "I've been watching, Elowen. I may not know what you know, but I've been paying attention." She sat with that for a moment. It was not a small thing, what he'd just said. It was the kind of small, large thing that marriages were made of, the accumulation of quiet attention that didn't announce itself and didn't demand recognition. "Thursday," she said. The lawyer she found in Callaway was a woman in her late 50s named Cordell, who had practiced property law for 30 years, and who read the easement documentation with the speed and precision of someone who had seen every version of this particular argument before. Cordell set the papers down after 8 minutes and said, "The easement concerns cattle passage through the lower corner, approximately 40 feet wide, for the purpose of seasonal grazing transit. It confers no rights to the water source. The spring is deeded property. This is not ambiguous to anyone who reads property law." "But it could be made to look ambiguous," Elowen said. Cordell looked at her with the measured expression of someone who has learned not to be surprised by what people with money will attempt. "It could be presented as ambiguous in a filing, yes, which is different from being ambiguous." She paused. "Are you expecting such a filing?" "I'm expecting it's possible." "Then what you want is a formal legal clarification on record, signed and witnessed, establishing the spring as unencumbered Mercer property, filed with the county. That way, if someone files a claim, there's already a counter document in the record, and any competent judge takes approximately 4 minutes to resolve it." "How long does the clarification take to prepare?" "I can have it ready in 5 days. Your husband will need to sign as co-owner." Elowen looked at the fee Cordell had written on the corner of her notepad. She did the arithmetic against her current balance. It was going to be tight enough that the next delivery to Tobias needed to come in full and on time with no shortfall. 5 days, she said. "That works." She drove home through the late afternoon with the particular alertness of someone who has been managing a crisis long enough that alertness has become a resting state. She was tired in the specific way of someone who is running on the momentum of necessity rather than on actual energy, and she recognized it because she'd been managing that feeling for weeks. It was sustainable, but not indefinitely. At some point, the work and the worry and the sleeplessness would catch up to her in some way she couldn't predict, and she was trying to stay ahead of that moment by sheer willpower, which she understood was not a strategy so much as a temporary extension. The herd was on the upper slope when she got back, the late sun angling across the hillside in a way that made the animals look almost golden against the brush. She stopped the wagon for a moment and watched them work the ridge line. Methodical, unhurried, entirely indifferent to the human dramas occurring around and because of them. She thought about the gray doe with the cloudy eye, who had been a dying animal in a bad pen 6 weeks ago and was now the heaviest producer in the herd. She thought about what Crady had said on the day she'd ridden up with Jonas to ask questions, that the particular quality of a goat was that it thrived where other animals couldn't, not in spite of the difficult conditions, but because of them. She put the wagon in motion and drove toward the barn. Inside the cellar, the cedar shelves held 17 wheels in various stages of aging. The newest batch still white and tight-rinded. The middle ones beginning to show the gold that meant the rind was doing its work. The oldest, a 9-week wheel she'd been watching more carefully than the rest. Darker still, with a firmness when she pressed the flat of her hand against it that felt, she thought, like something worth the trouble it had taken to produce it. She wrote the day's figures in the logbook. Milk volume, up again, 3rd consecutive week of increase. Batch 4, on schedule. Delivery to Tobias, 6 days. Aldwick's first standing order, 2 weeks. Legal clarification, 5 days. Banknote, 61 days. 61 days? The number sat at the bottom of the column like a period at the end of a sentence that wasn't quite finished yet. She closed the logbook and straightened up slowly and stood in the quiet of the root cellar with the smell of aging cheese around her, that sharp, mineral, alive smell that she had come to associate with the possibility of surviving the year. She'd made something in this cellar, not just cheese, a case, an argument, a record of what happened when you looked at a thing everyone agreed was worthless and asked, instead, what it was actually good for. She picked up the lantern and went back to the house. There was still dinner to make, and morning would come early, and in 61 days she needed to be standing in Harlan Price's bank with everything she needed to say, everything the words couldn't. She was not going to get there by standing still. The legal clarification came back from Cordell in 4 days, not 5, which was the first thing in several weeks that had arrived ahead of schedule rather than behind it. Elowen read it at the kitchen table the morning Jonas brought it in from the postwriter, reading it twice through with the careful attention she gave to anything she was going to need to rely on, checking the language against what she remembered of the original survey notes and the deed language. It said exactly what Cordell had said it would say. Unambiguous, clean, with the county seal and the date and the attorney's signature and the specific citation of the spring's coordinates within the Mercer property boundaries. It removed the ambiguity from the record the way you remove a splinter, completely, with the understanding that something that seems small can cause serious damage if you leave it in place. She put it in the folder with the other documents and filed it in the cedar box under the kitchen shelf where the banknote lived. Then she went back to work, because the legal problem being solved did not change the production schedule, did not milk the dues or turn the aging wheels or prepare the next batch, and the banknote did not care that she'd spent money on a lawyer she hadn't budgeted for. What she didn't know yet, what she couldn't have known because the information hadn't reached her, was that Rusk had already moved. She found out on a Thursday, 8 days after filing the clarification, from Tobias Creed. She'd come in for a delivery, 5 wheels, the best batch she'd produced yet, the 10-week wheel among them that she'd been aging specifically because she wanted Tobias to see what the product looked like at full development. She'd been looking forward to this delivery in the specific way you look forward to showing someone evidence of something they doubted. Tobias had not doubted her, exactly, but he was a man whose confidence in a supplier grew incrementally with each successful delivery, and she wanted to move him further along that curve. He met her at the wagon instead of waiting at his desk, which was not his habit, and the expression on his face was the controlled neutrality of a man about to say something he'd been thinking about how to say. "There's a problem," he said. She waited, I got a visit yesterday from a man who works for Rusk's operation. Not Rusk himself, one of his people. A man named Cutter. He paused. Cutter told me there's a water rights dispute on your property. Said the spring you're using for production is under a contested claim. Said until it's resolved, any buyer purchasing from your operation is taking on commercial risk because you may not have legal access to the water source. Elowen felt the architecture of it click into place in her head. The claim hadn't been filed to win. It couldn't win. She had Cordell's clarification and the original deed language, and nobody with a working knowledge of property law would look at the documentation and see a genuine dispute. The claim had been filed to create a conversation exactly like the one Tobias was having with her right now, to put a question mark next to her name in the mind of people she was doing business with. The water rights aren't disputed, she said. I have a legal clarification from a property attorney on file with the county, dated 8 days ago. The spring is deeded Mercer property. The easement on the lower corner concerns cattle passage only and confers zero rights to the water source. She paused. The claim Rusk's man described is either based on a misreading of the survey language or it's being filed in bad faith. Either way, it won't survive a competent review. Tobias looked at her steadily. Do you have the clarification document with you? She had not brought it. She hadn't known she'd need it today because she hadn't known Rusk had already moved. That was the thing about not watching carefully enough. You found out after the fact that you'd underestimated the speed of something. I can bring it tomorrow morning, she said. Bring it today, he said. I need it before I can talk to the Callaway buyers. They heard the same conversation. Cutter apparently made the rounds. She drove home, retrieved the document from the cedar box, and drove back. The round trip cost her 3 hours she didn't have and burned feed for the horse at a rate she hadn't planned for, and by the time she put the document on Tobias's desk, she was tired and angry in the specific way of someone who is tired and angry at the right target but has no useful outlet for it yet. Tobias read Cordell's clarification. He read it carefully, not quickly, which was either good or bad depending on what he concluded. Then he set it down and said, "This is clear." "Yes," Elowen said. "I'll send copies to Callaway. The buyers will want to see the original county filing. I can get you a certified copy from the county clerk by Monday. Monday works." He looked at her. "Rusk doesn't usually do things like this." "He usually doesn't have a reason to," she said. Tobias was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she didn't expect. "I've been in business in this valley for 22 years. I've seen Rusk expand into 4 different operations and squeeze out 2 families that were in his way. I've never told anyone what to do about him because it was never my business." He picked up the clarification document and set it aside with the deliberate care of a man establishing where something belongs. "I'm telling you now that this delivery is going out to Callaway on Saturday, and I'm telling my buyers the claim is unfounded, and I'm showing them this document because your product is the best shelf-stable cheese I've moved in 3 years, and I'm not letting one man's politics disrupt a commercial relationship that's working." She looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it in the way you mean things when they matter beyond the situation that produced them. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just keep the quality consistent." She drove home in the early dark, and the anger was still there, but it had changed shape slightly. It was less reactive and more structural now, the kind of anger that knows what it wants to do instead of just knowing what it's responding to. Rusk had attacked from the water direction, and it hadn't worked. He had gone to her buyers, and it hadn't worked, or at least it wasn't going to work as far as Tobias was concerned, and if Tobias held, then Callaway would hold because Tobias's word was the thing they were buying as much as the product itself. But she needed to think about what came next, because Rusk hadn't won this round and he knew it by now, or would know it soon, and men like Rusk did not accept being outmaneuvered quietly. She told Jonas that night, all of it, Cutter's visit to Tobias, the attempt to poison her commercial relationships, what Tobias had said, what she expected Rusk might try next. Jonas listened without interrupting, which was his way when she was telling him something complicated. When she finished, he said, "What do you think he'll do?" "I think he'll go back to the bank," she said. "I think the water claim was a setup for the bank approach, not a standalone move. If he can get Price to cite the disputed claim as a legal encumbrance before it's been formally dismissed, he can argue the acceleration clause applies. Can he? He can try. Cordell's clarification makes it harder, but it doesn't make it impossible because the clarification is a response to an ambiguity. And Price could argue that the existence of any ambiguity triggers the clause, regardless of how quickly it gets resolved. She paused. It's a bad faith reading of the contract, but Price doesn't need it to be a good faith reading. He just needs it to be defensible enough that it takes us months to contest it in court, by which time we've either lost the farm or been forced into a settlement Rusk controls. Jonas was quiet for long enough that she could hear the wind picking up outside, coming down from the ridge the way it did on cold nights when the temperature was planning to drop significantly before morning. "What do we do?" he said. "We pay the note," she said, "before Price can call it. We get the full amount together, and we walk it into that bank, and we end this." "We're not there yet," Jonas said, and it wasn't an argument, just a fact, said in the flat tone of a man who has been doing arithmetic all evening and keeps arriving at the same number. "I know," she said, "but we're closer than we were. And if I can get the next 2 deliveries in full, and if Aldwick's December order holds—" She stopped and did it in her head one more time, the way she'd been doing it all evening, running the columns forward from where they were to where they needed to be. "If everything hits the way it should, we're within reach by the 3rd week of November. The note's due end of November. I know when the note's due. That's a tight window if Rusk tries to accelerate." "Everything has been a tight window," she said. "That's not new." He nodded slowly, the way he nodded when he'd accepted a situation he didn't like. Then he said, "What do you need from me?" She thought for a moment. "I need the upper pasture fence finished before the first hard freeze. If I lose animals to a fence break in bad weather, I lose production, and I can't afford that margin right now. I'll have it done by next Friday, and I need you to start learning the batch process, not just the milking, the full process, separation, pressing, rind management, aging protocol, everything." He looked at her. "Why?" "Because if something happens to me, if I get sick, if I get hurt, this operation cannot stop. It doesn't have the room to stop." She met his eyes. "I need you to be able to run this without me for 2 weeks if you have to." He didn't say anything for a moment. She could see him taking in the full weight of what she was saying. Not just the practical request, but the acknowledgement underneath it. The admission that she was running so hard and so close to the edge that the possibility of her going down was something they needed to plan for. "Show me," he said, "starting tomorrow." She did. Every morning for the next week, she walked him through each step, not explaining as she went, but stopping and making him do it while she watched. There's a difference between watching someone do a thing and doing the thing yourself, and she needed him to learn it in his hands, not just in his head. He made mistakes. The separation temperature was wrong the first time he managed it alone, and she caught it before the batch was compromised, but it was closer than she liked. And she corrected him without drama, because drama was a thing she genuinely did not have space for anymore. He learned quickly once he understood what he was learning. Jonas had always been a man who could acquire a physical skill if someone showed him clearly what it looked like when done right, and she showed him clearly. And by the 5th morning, he was running the separation process with only occasional questions. The 6th morning, she let him run the full sequence alone. She sat at the kitchen table with the logbook and listened to him moving in the milk room, and told herself she was doing this because it was the right operational decision, and not because she was so exhausted she could barely sit upright at 6 in the morning. Both things were true. The news about the bank came from Hattie Dunmore again, on a gray November morning when Elowen was driving back from the county clerk's office with the certified copy of Cordell's clarification. Hattie flagged her down on the road with the urgency of someone who has been watching for a vehicle and is relieved to see it. "Price sent a letter," Hattie said, before Elowen had fully stopped. "I heard it from the clerk's assistant. He sent a letter to the Mercer property 2 days ago." Elowen's stomach dropped approximately 3 inches. 2 days ago? "The post rider's been slow because of the weather on the eastern route." Hattie looked at her with the precise expression of a woman who understands the full weight of what she's saying. "I don't know what's in it, but Rusk was at the bank the morning before it went out." Elowen thanked her, turned the wagon around, and drove home at a pace that was too fast for the road condition and justified by the circumstances. The letter was on the kitchen shelf. Jonas had received it from the post rider the previous morning and left it unopened on the shelf because they had an agreement. Letters from the bank were opened together. He was in the barn when she got home, and she went straight to the shelf and looked at the envelope for approximately 4 seconds before she opened it herself. It was 2 paragraphs. The The legal language was careful and dense the way bank language always was, designed to communicate something serious while maintaining the plausible deniability of routine correspondence. She read it twice to make sure she understood what it was saying. Harlan Price was citing the acceleration clause. His stated basis was the water rights ambiguity, the unresolved claim against the spring, which he characterized as a legal encumbrance on the property serving as collateral. He gave them 30 days from the date of the letter to either resolve the encumbrance to the bank's satisfaction or pay the note in full. The date on the letter was 4 days ago, which meant she'd already lost 4 days to postal delay. She had put the letter down on the kitchen table and stood in the quiet kitchen and breathed. The clarification was on file. Cordell's document was sitting in the county record. The claim Rusk had used as the pretext for this letter was either already dismissed or would be dismissed the moment it came before a competent review. None of that changed the arithmetic of the situation she was now in. She had 26 days to either formally establish that no legal encumbrance existed to Price's satisfaction, which required getting Cordell involved again, and potentially going through Price's legal review process, or she had 26 days to pay the note in full. She got out her ledger and did the numbers. She had done these numbers so many times over the past months that the act of running them was almost physical. She could feel each figure settle into place as she wrote it, feel the weight of what the column was adding up to before she reached the bottom. Current balance. Tobias's next payment, due in 11 days. Aldwick's December order, due in 18 days. Operating costs through end of month. What was left? She stared at the bottom number for a long time. She was short. Not catastrophically short, not impossibly short, but short by an amount that the ordinary pace of deliveries wouldn't close in 26 days. She needed the Tobias payment and the Aldwick payment and something else, something that wasn't already in the schedule. She thought about Tobias's words to her, the best shelf-stable cheese I've moved in 3 years. She thought about the freight captains he'd mentioned, the buyers in Callaway. She thought about what Aldwick had said, I'm buying your product, not a type of product. Then she thought about the 14 wheels aging on her cellar shelves. 9 of them were at 7 weeks or older. The oldest was at 11 weeks, a wheel she'd been letting develop specifically to see what the product looked like at its maximum development. Harder, more complex in flavor, the rind deep gold and completely firm. She'd been planning to keep it as a reference sample, as evidence of what the operation could eventually produce at its best. She did the math on selling those 9 wheels, all of them, at the price Tobias and Aldwick were currently paying, with the additional premium Tobias had mentioned buyers would pay for the longer-aged wheels. It was close, very close. With Tobias's regular payment and those 9 wheels, she'd be within reach of the full amount. But only if the wheels sold. Only if buyers were willing to pay the premium price without a long lead time for the order. And only if she could get the money in hand before the 26 days ran out. She was still at the table when Jonas came in from the barn. He looked at the letter, he looked at her. He sat down without speaking, and she pushed the ledger across to him and let him read the numbers the way he always read them, slowly and thoroughly, going back to check figures, not satisfied with a quick scan. When he finished, he said, You're thinking about the cellar inventory? Yes. That's your production buffer. If you sell those wheels now, you're going into December without the aging stock you need to maintain the delivery schedule. I know. It sets you back 6 weeks on volume. I know, Jonas. He pushed the ledger back. So if you do this, you pay the note. But then you're rebuilding from a smaller base during the slowest production months. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. And if you don't? She didn't answer because he already knew the answer, and saying it out loud didn't serve any purpose. He put both hands flat on the table. What do you need me to do? I need to go to Tobias tomorrow, she said. I need to tell him I want to sell the aged inventory on an accelerated basis. I need him to call his buyers and find out who will pay premium price on short notice for wheels at 7 weeks and above. She paused. And I need him to do it fast because I can't spend 10 days waiting for an answer. Then go tomorrow, Jonas said. I'll run the morning milking. She went. Tobias listened to her lay out the situation without interrupting. Not the bank letter specifically. She gave him the commercial version. The version that said she needed to move aged inventory quickly and was willing to discount slightly against standard premium price to facilitate fast payment. She did not tell him about the acceleration clause or the 30-day window or Rusk's involvement in the bank's decision. She'd learned from 2 months of watching Bramwell Rusk operate that there was a difference between the information that helped you and the information that just made people nervous. And Tobias did not need to be nervous right now. She needed him thinking clearly and moving fast. He considered it for a moment. How many wheels and what age range? 9 wheels, range from 7 to 11 weeks. The 11-week one is the best thing I've produced. Premium price on the 11-week wheel. I'd want my buyers to see it before they commit. Tell them it comes from the same production as the wheels they've already bought and approved. The 11-week is that product at further development, not a different product. She paused. If they've liked what they've had, the only question is whether they want more of the same thing at a longer cure. Tobias was quiet for a moment. I can reach the Callaway provisioner today. Aldwych might take 2 wheels on short notice. There's a freight captain out of the Southern Run, man named Prentice, who's been asking me about your cheese specifically for 2 weeks. He supplies a long-distance route and shelf life is his primary concern. Elowen had not heard the name Prentice before. How long is the route? 6 weeks from loading to final delivery, mountain passage included. He needs something that holds through that. An 11-week wheel with a tight rind and low moisture content, held in a cool wagon on a mountain route. She calculated it in her head. It'll hold, she said. If he stores it properly on the wagon, it'll arrive better than he expects. Then let me reach him today. She drove home and spent the afternoon checking every wheel in the cellar, running her hand over each rind, checking the logbook against her visual assessment, pulling 2 wheels she decided didn't meet the premium standard, and setting them aside for the regular delivery schedule. She was not going to sell a substandard wheel at premium price to buyers she needed for the long term. That kind of thinking was the thinking of someone who was running out of options, and she refused to let the bank deadline turn her into that kind of producer. 7 wheels passed the assessment. Not 9. 7. She recalculated the math. It was tighter, but the numbers still worked if Tobias moved them at full premium price. She was in the barn that evening checking on the 3 youngest does, who'd been producing inconsistently for the past 4 days in a way that concerned her. Not sick, exactly, but something was off in their rhythms and she hadn't pinpointed it yet, when she heard hooves on the track and came out to find a rider she didn't recognize. Young man, maybe 20, wearing a coat with a freight company insignia she didn't know. Looking for the Mercer operation, the rider said. You found it, she said. I've got a letter from Mr. Prentice. He said to deliver it personal and wait for a reply. She took the letter, opened it, read it. Prentice wanted 4 wheels at the longest age she could provide, willing to pay a 30% premium above standard price for guaranteed shelf life documentation, which she understood to mean he wanted her logbook records for those specific wheels, not just her word. He was ready to pay on delivery. He could take delivery at Tobias's freight office by the end of the week. She did the math standing in the barn doorway with the letter in her hand and the rider waiting on his horse. 4 wheels at premium price, plus Aldwich's 2, plus Tobias's standing order payment. The number hit the bottom line and came out the other side of the banknote with a margin that was not comfortable but was real. She went inside and wrote a reply that took 4 minutes and said yes to all of Prentice's terms and specified that she'd have the logbook records for the relevant wheels copied and certified by Thursday. She gave the reply to the rider and watched him turn back down the track. Then she stood in the doorway for a moment and let herself feel the specific sensation of something that has been falling for a long time finding a floor. Not landing safely, not resolved. There was still too much to do before she could call any of this resolved. But the falling part, the part where she'd been unable to see how the numbers were going to close, that part had stopped. She went back to the does. The inconsistency in their production, she figured out by 7 that evening, was a temperature issue. The nights had been dropping faster than she'd realized, and the barn where they sheltered was losing heat through a gap in the north wall that Jonas had been planning to address before the first hard freeze and hadn't gotten to yet. Not a health problem, a comfort problem. Cold goats milked inconsistently, same as cold people worked inconsistently. She woke Jonas at 9 and told him. North wall, she said. It has to be tonight or tomorrow morning at the latest. I can't have their production disrupted right now. He didn't argue or check the time. He got up, found his tools, and went to the barn. She sat at the kitchen table with the logbook and started copying the records for Prentice's 4 wheels by lamplight. Every batch date, temperature, press weight, rind condition assessment, the daily notations for each relevant wheel over its entire aging period. It was painstaking work in the way that anything done carefully by hand in inadequate light is painstaking, and her handwriting got slightly worse as the evening wore on, but the record was accurate. She made it accurate the way she made everything accurate, because accuracy was the only protection she had against the version of events that people with more power than she had would otherwise construct. She heard Jonas hammering in the barn. She heard the wind working on the ridge. She heard the goats settling, their small bells making the irregular sound she'd come to know, the way you come to know a sound that means something is all right. She finished the first wheel's record and started the second. Tobias confirmed Aldwick's two-wheel purchase by Friday morning. Prentice's rider came back with confirmation of delivery location and time by Friday afternoon. By Friday evening, Elowen had 7 wheels wrapped and loaded in the wagon, the logbook copies sealed in an oilskin envelope for Prentice, and a number in her head that had moved from tighter than she liked to something approaching adequate. She made the delivery Saturday morning with Jonas riding alongside. He'd insisted, not because she needed the help loading, but because he wanted to see it complete. She hadn't argued. There were moments when being witnessed by the person who knew what something cost was its own kind of important, and this was one of them. Tobias counted the wheels, checked the logbook copies, and had the payment ready in a combination of cash and a bank draft that she folded into the cedar box along with the banknote and Cordell's clarification the moment she got home. She sat at the kitchen table and wrote the new bottom line in the ledger. She looked at it for a moment. Then she wrote next to it, in the margin, "Not yet, close," because she was not going to let herself believe she was safe until she was standing in Harlan Price's office with the full amount in her hand. Bramwell Rusk still had 22 days to find another angle. Price still had the acceleration clause and the motivation to use it if Rusk pressed. The clarification was in the county record, but county records could be challenged, could be delayed, could be buried in procedural complexity long enough to do damage. She knew all of that. She held it alongside the number in the ledger and let both things be true simultaneously, which was something she'd learned to do over the past 4 months. To hold the progress and the threat in the same hand without letting either one crowd out the other. Jonas was washing up at the kitchen basin when she closed the ledger. He looked at her in the mirror above the basin, not directly, just the reflection, which was how Jonas often looked at things he wasn't sure how to approach frontally. "Where are we?" he said. "Aldwick's December payment comes in 18 days, she said. "If it comes in on schedule and Tobias's next standing order pays on the regular cycle, we'll have the full amount with approximately 12 days to spare before the end of Price's 30-day window." "Approximately," Jonas said. "Yes." He dried his hands. "And if something goes wrong?" She'd been thinking about that question since Saturday morning, riding alongside the wagon with the 7 wheels in the bed, running scenarios the way she ran them when she couldn't stop herself from running them. What if Aldwick's order was delayed? What if Tobias's buyer in Callaway pulled back? What if the Does production dipped again and the next batch ran short? What if Rusk had a move she still hadn't seen? "Then I figure out what to do about whatever goes wrong," she said. "Same as every other time." He came and sat across from her. He looked at the closed ledger, and then at her face, and then at the ledger again. "I've been thinking," he said. She waited. "About what you said, when you told me to learn the full process in case something happened to you." He paused. "I've been thinking about what it means that you said that." She looked at him. "It means I'm realistic about risk. It means you've been carrying this alone," he said, "for 4 months. You've been in your head with all of it, and I've been here, but I haven't been—" He stopped. He was working at something, trying to find the shape of a thing he wanted to say but wasn't practiced at saying. "I let you carry it alone," he said, "even when I should have asked more, even when I could see it was getting heavy." She sat with that for a moment. "You fixed the north wall at 9 in the evening," she said. "You learned the milking schedule. You rode with me Saturday." She paused. "You're here, Jonas. That's not nothing." "It's not enough." "Maybe not," she said. "But we're not done yet. There's still time to do better." He nodded, slowly, and there was something in it that was more than agreement. It was the look of a man who has understood something precisely and intends to act on it, which was the version of Jonas she'd been watching emerge over the past months, incrementally, beneath the practical daily surface of fence posts and cedar boards and barn walls fixed in the dark. Outside, the night had settled fully over the valley. The ridge was invisible against the sky. Somewhere on the upper slope, the descendants of 39 dying goats were doing what they did, browsing, settling, converting the difficult landscape into something the operation needed. They didn't know about banknotes or acceleration clauses, or a powerful man who was watching from the edge of everything and waiting for his moment to move. Elowen knew. She was watching back. She opened the logbook to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top, and under it she wrote the figures for the day. And under those she wrote the projection for the next 18 days. And she sat with the lamp burning low and the night pressing at the windows and worked through the numbers until she knew them the way she knew everything she'd decided to trust. Thoroughly, from first principle to final conclusion, without comfort and without doubt. The following morning she was up at 4:30. Not because the does needed milking at 4:30, they didn't, they needed it at 5. But because she'd been lying awake for an hour already, and lying still had stopped serving any useful purpose, and she needed to check something in the cellar that she'd been meaning to check since yesterday and hadn't gotten to. She lit the lantern and went down the cellar steps and stood in front of the remaining aging shelves, the wheels she'd kept back from the premium sale, the buffer that was now thinner than she liked, but still there. 8 wheels at various stages, enough to maintain the delivery schedule through the next 2 batches. Enough, she thought, as long as nothing unexpected hit the production. She pressed the rind of the oldest remaining wheel. Firm. Even. The gold color that meant the interior was developing the way it should. Creddy's notes had described this stage as the wheel knowing what it is, which was the kind of language an 81-year-old man could deploy without embarrassment, and which Elowen had found, to her slight surprise, to be exactly accurate. She straightened up in the low-ceilinged cellar and looked at the rows of cheese and felt something she hadn't let herself feel since the auction yard. In the summer, since the moment Fitch's gavel came down and the yard laughed and she'd kept her hand up, she felt certain. Not certain the way people meant when they said things would work out. She had no patience for that kind of certainty. Certain the way a wheel of properly aged cheese was certain. Hard on the outside, fully developed within, built to withstand what was coming. She went upstairs and started the fire for the morning milk. 18 days. Whatever Rusk was planning, he had 18 days to do it in. And Elowen Mercer had been working toward this moment since before she even fully knew what she was working toward, and she was not going to come this far and give it back to a man who had never looked at anything she'd built and seen anything other than something to be stopped. She put the first pot on the fire. The lantern threw her shadow long across the kitchen wall. Outside, the valley was still dark. She got to work. The 18 days did not pass cleanly. She had known they wouldn't. She had been doing this long enough to understand that the final stretch of any hard thing was rarely the straightforward march to the finish line that you imagined it might be when you were still far enough away that the details were blurry. The details were never blurry up close. Up close they were sharp-edged and specific, and they had a way of arriving in combinations that no single plan fully accounted for. The first problem came on day 4. The gray doe, the animal with the cloudy eye, who had been Elowen's heaviest producer since the 2nd month, the one she'd been planning to priority breed in the spring, the one she'd sat in the dirt next to on the 3rd day after the auction when it wasn't clear whether the animal was going to decide to live, went off her feed. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself as a crisis. She simply ate less on Tuesday morning, and Elowen noticed because she noticed everything about the herd now in the granular, specific way of someone who has learned to read subtle changes as early warning rather than waiting for the obvious signs. By Tuesday afternoon, the doe's milk production had dropped. By Wednesday morning, she was standing apart from the rest of the herd in the way animals stood when something internal was wrong. Elowen had no veterinary training beyond what she'd taught herself and what Creedy had passed on, and what 4 months of intensive daily management had built into her hands and her eyes. She went through everything she knew systematically. Not panicked, she'd learned that panic was a thing that cost time without producing anything useful. Methodical. She checked the animal's temperature, which was elevated but not severely. She checked her gums and her eyes and her belly. She changed the feed, separated her from the herd, increased her water access. By Thursday morning, the doe was eating again. By Friday, her production was back to 70% of normal. It would take another week to fully recover, and that week of reduced output from the herd's best producer put a dent in the batch she'd been planning to have ready for Tobias's December delivery, which in turn put pressure on her delivery timeline, which in turn put pressure on the payment schedule she'd been counting on to close the gap before Price's window ran out. She recalculated everything on Friday evening. The math still worked, but the margin had shrunk from 12 days to 7. 7 days was not comfortable. 7 days meant that if Aldwick's payment arrived late, or if the December weather delayed Tobias's wagon schedule, or if anything else went sideways in the next 2 weeks, she was going to be making the final push on the banknote with no buffer. She didn't tell Jonas about the 7 days. She told him the dough was recovering and the batch would be slightly smaller than projected, and she was adjusting the delivery schedule accordingly. All of that was true. She left out the part about the margin because she had made a decision somewhere in the past 2 weeks that she was going to carry the close arithmetic herself rather than putting it on him every time the numbers shifted. He was doing his part. He was running the morning milking 3 days a week now without supervision, managing the upper pasture fence maintenance, handling the feed storage, watching the cellar temperature every evening before he came in. He was doing more than she'd asked and more than she'd expected, and she was not going to reward that by feeding him anxiety she could manage herself. This was probably not the right decision. She was aware of that. There was a version of partnership where you shared the sharp edges equally, and she wasn't always living in that version. But she was tired in a way that made certain kinds of honesty feel like one more weight she didn't have the capacity for right now, and she was making the best choices available with the energy she had left. The second problem came on day 9. She got a letter from Cordell, Rusk's attorney, a man named Beale who operated out of a larger town 2 valleys over and who had, Cordell's letter noted, a reputation for filing motions with the specific intent of creating procedural delay rather than winning arguments, had filed a formal challenge to the county clarification, not to the underlying property claim, which Beale was apparently sophisticated enough to know was unwinnable. He'd challenged the clarification on procedural grounds, a technical argument about the timing of the original survey notations, and whether the clarification had been properly filed under the applicable county code. Cordell was direct about it. The challenge had no substantive merit. A competent judge would dismiss it. But the filing created a period of procedural uncertainty, potentially 2 to 3 weeks, during which the county record technically showed an active challenge to the clarification that Elowen had provided to Harlan Price. She read the letter twice, then read it a third time, then set it down on the kitchen table and looked at it for a long moment without reading it again. This was the move she hadn't seen. Not the water claim, which had been the setup, not the acceleration letter, which had been the pressure. This, a procedural challenge that couldn't win but could create exactly enough uncertainty to give Price the cover he needed to hold the acceleration in place while the challenge worked through the county process. It was designed to run out the clock. If the challenge stayed active through Price's 30-day window, Price could argue that the encumbrance remained legally unresolved regardless of what the underlying document said, and use that argument to enforce the acceleration clause while Beale's filing was technically pending. It was not a smart legal strategy. It was a smart time strategy. She sat at the table for 15 minutes, then she wrote a reply to Cordell asking one question. What's the fastest the challenge can be formally dismissed? Cordell's reply came back in 2 days. Under the applicable county procedure, a motion to dismiss Beale's challenge could be filed immediately. A hearing could potentially be scheduled within 10 days, possibly faster, if she could demonstrate urgency. The judge assigned to the county docket was a man named Harwick, who Cordell described as impatient with procedural delay tactics and familiar with Beale's methods, potentially within 10 days. Price's window had 12 days left when Cordell's reply arrived. She wrote back to Cordell the same afternoon. File the motion, push for the earliest possible hearing. She would cover the additional legal cost from Aldwick's December payment, which was due in 9 days. Then she sat down with her ledger and recalculated everything, again, with the legal cost factored in. The margin went from 7 days to 4. 4 days. She was building a case for her financial survival on a margin of 4 days, with a legal proceeding that was dependent on a court calendar she didn't control, a payment from Aldwick that hadn't arrived yet, and a production schedule that had already taken one hit from the gray doe's illness and couldn't absorb another. She looked at the 4-day margin for a long time. Then she closed the ledger and went to check on the herd. The gray doe was at the fence when she came up the hill, watching her approach with the alert curiosity of an animal that had decided to be interested in the world again, which was a good sign. The best possible sign from an animal that had been moving between present and absent for the past week. Elowen put her hand over the fence and let the doe sniff it, and then scratched the side of her jaw the way the animal liked. The cloudiness in the left eye caught the afternoon light. "You pick your moments," Elowen said to the goat, to no one specifically. The doe pressed her head into Elowen's hand, and Elowen stood there for a minute, just being that, a woman with her hand on a goat's jaw on a rocky hillside in the late November cold, and let everything else stop for 60 seconds before she turned and went back down to the work. Aldwick's payment arrived on day 11, not day 9 as scheduled. Day 11. The 2-day delay would have been meaningless in ordinary circumstances. In these circumstances, it meant that Cordell's additional legal fee came out of operating reserves rather than being covered by the Aldwick payment before it arrived, which meant she was running negative for 48 hours in a way that required her to make a phone call to Tobias, asking him to advance 2 days on the next standing order payment. She hated making that call. Not because Tobias was difficult, he wasn't, he confirmed the advance within the hour, but because it was the first time in 4 months she'd had to ask anyone for a financial accommodation, and it felt like a crack in the structural integrity of what she'd been building. She had been the person with the logbook and the documented production and the signed orders and the numbers that told their own story without requiring apology or explanation. Asking for an advance, even a small one, even from a man who had every commercial reason to grant it, made her feel the precariousness of the whole thing in a way that the abstract numbers in the ledger didn't quite capture. She wrote it down in the logbook anyway. Date, amount, terms, reason, because she was not going to hide from the record of what this cost, even the parts that were uncomfortable. The hearing on Beale's procedural challenge was scheduled for day 14. That left 3 days between the hearing and the end of Price's window, assuming the judge ruled immediately, which Cordell said was likely given Harwick's known impatience but not guaranteed. 3 days was not a comfortable margin. She drove to the county seat for the hearing because she needed to be there. Not because Cordell required her presence. This was a procedural motion, not a full hearing, and Cordell was entirely capable of handling it alone. But because Elowen had learned, in 4 months of building something in the face of a more powerful opponent, that the moments when your presence was not strictly required were often the moments when your presence mattered most. Being there meant the record showed she was paying attention. Being there meant Beale could see her in the room. Being there meant that whatever happened, she was a witness to it, and not a recipient of secondhand information, and she trusted her own reading of a room more than she trusted any summary. Jonas had offered to come with her. She told him to stay with the herd because the gray doe still needed monitoring and the does couldn't go a morning without proper milking at this point in the production cycle. He'd accepted this with the look of a man who understood the reasoning and didn't like it, which was fine. She wasn't asking him to like it. The county courthouse was a 2-story stone building that smelled like old wood and lamp oil and the particular dustiness of rooms where important things were decided in unremarkable surroundings. She found the right courtroom and sat in the back row and watched Cordell and Beale present their respective positions to Judge Harwick, who was a compact man in his 60s with a face that gave almost nothing away and a manner of listening that suggested he had already heard every version of every argument and was now primarily interested in whether this particular version contained anything new. It did not appear to. Beale made his procedural argument with the practiced efficiency of a man who knew the argument was thin and was not pretending otherwise. He was simply making it, clearly and correctly, because that was what he was paid to do, and because even a thin argument could create a period of uncertainty if the judge was inclined to let it. Harwick was not inclined to let it. He asked Beale 2 questions. Beale answered both. Harwick turned to Cordell, who added 3 sentences to what she'd already said in her written motion, and then stopped, because she was experienced enough to know when a judge didn't need more information and only needed the space to say what he'd already decided. Harwick dismissed the challenge. He did it in 4 sentences, 2 of which were procedural formalities, and 2 of which were a fairly blunt assessment of the filing's merits. He used the word frivolous, which was a specific legal term with specific implications, and Elowen watched Beale write something down in his notes, with the practiced neutrality of a man who charged by the hour, whether the outcome was good or bad. She was out of the courthouse and on the road back to Ravenridge within 20 minutes of the ruling. The drive home was long enough that she had time to do the arithmetic one final time, all of it, from beginning to end, with Cordell's confirmation of the dismissal in her hand, and Tobias's advance already credited, and Aldwick's payment arrived and sitting in the cedar box with everything else. She ran the numbers in her head the way she'd been running them since August. The specific meditative arithmetic of a woman who had learned to find something close to calm in the act of counting what she actually had against what she actually needed. The number at the end was enough. Not by a large margin, not by the kind of margin that let you breathe easily and stop checking over your shoulder, but enough. Enough to walk into Harlan Price's bank and put the full amount on his desk, in cash and certified drafts, and close the note. She got home as the early winter dark was settling over the valley. Jonas was at the barn. She went straight to the cedar box under the kitchen shelf and counted everything in it one more time. Not because she didn't believe the number, but because she needed to feel it in her hands. The cash from Tobias's advance and his standing payment. Aldwick's bank draft. The two earlier payments that she'd been holding because she hadn't had the full amount yet, and she'd needed the buffer. The certified copy of Cordell's clarification. The dismissal notice that Cordell had handed her outside the courthouse. She spread it all on the kitchen table and looked at it. This was what 4 months looked like, laid out in paper and ink. This was what 39 dying goats and an old man's notes and a root cellar and cedar shelves and a logbook filled from cover to cover looked like when you converted it into the language that banks understood. She was still sitting at the table when Jonas came in. He looked at everything spread out in front of her. He looked at her face. "It's enough?" he said. "It's enough," she said. He sat down slowly, across from her, and looked at the papers the way you look at something you've been afraid to look at directly for a long time. He picked up the bank draft from Aldwick and looked at the number on it and put it back down. He picked up Cordell's dismissal notice and read it through. She watched his face as he read, watching for the moment it landed. It landed in the set of his jaw. Not a dramatic response, just a tightening, a release. 4 months of worry finding somewhere to go. "The hearing went well," she said. "I can see that." Harwick used the word frivolous. Jonas looked up from the paper. "He said that in open court?" "He said it in front of Beale and everyone else in that room, yes." Jonas set the notice down. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "When do you want to go to the bank?" "Tomorrow morning," she said. "First thing." He nodded. "I'll hitch the wagon at 4:30. She started organizing the documents into the order she wanted to present them. Not just the payment, the whole picture. The logbook copies she'd prepared for Prentice, which she was going to leave a version of with Price as well, because she hadn't come this far to simply pay a debt and leave. She had come to pay a debt and then ask for something. She had been thinking about the expansion loan for 2 months, since before the acceleration letter, since before the premium sale, since the morning she'd stood in the cellar looking at 8 wheels on the shelves and understood that what she'd built was not a temporary solution to a single year's crisis, but the beginning of something that could grow if it had the capital to grow. She needed Price to see that. Not to feel it, not to be convinced by charm or desperation, to see it, in the same language he used for every other commercial decision he made. Numbers. Production records. Signed orders. Documented relationships with buyers who had already demonstrated willingness to pay premium price on a reliable schedule. She pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing the summary she was going to put in front of him. Jonas fell asleep in his chair sometime after 9. She covered him with the coat that hung by the door and kept writing. She was at the bank when it opened. Harlan Price was not a man she had ever liked, which was different from not being able to work with him. She had worked with people she didn't like her entire life. She approached the interaction with Price the same way she approached any difficult material. You understood its properties. You worked with what it was rather than what you wished it were, and you managed the process carefully enough that the difficulty didn't become a failure. Price was 50-some years old, heavy in the way of men who had been prosperous for long enough that comfort had settled into their posture. He had small eyes that moved quickly, the eyes of a man who was always calculating something, and he had the particular stillness of a man who was accustomed to being the most powerful person in most rooms he entered. He was not accustomed to 29-year-old women from rocky hillside farms walking into his bank at 8 in the morning with a cedar box under their arms. He met her in his office, which she had requested specifically, not the front counter, not the general floor. His office with the door closed, because what she had to say was not a brief transaction, and she was not going to have it in a room where anyone who walked in off the street could hear it. He looked at the cedar box. He looked at Jonas, who had insisted on coming in after all, and was now sitting slightly behind Elowen's left shoulder with the expression of a man who is committed to being present for something and intends to hold that commitment without interfering in it. "Mrs. Mercer," Price said, not warmly, neutrally. The specific neutrality of a man who is not certain what's about to happen and is not going to commit to any expression until he knows. "Mr. Price," she said. She placed the cedar box on the corner of his desk and opened it. "I'm here to pay the note." She laid it out in order. The cash first, counting it on his desk in front of him because she wanted him to watch the amount accumulate, and then the bank drafts, each one with the payer's name visible. Tobias Creed, Aldwick Provisions. She did not rush. She placed each item deliberately, the way you place evidence when you want someone to understand that each piece was earned separately and that the total represents something more than a single lucky transaction. When the full amount was on the desk, she said, "I'd like a receipt showing the note paid in full and the acceleration notice withdrawn." He looked at the money. He looked at the drafts. He picked up one of the drafts and examined it with the brief, practiced attention of a man who handles documents all day. Then he said, "The challenge to the property clarification was dismissed by Judge Harwick yesterday morning," she said. She placed Cordell's dismissal notice on top of the stack. "Procedural challenge, no substantive merit, dismissed with the characterization frivolous. The certified clarification has been on county record for 3 weeks. The spring is unencumbered Mercer property. There is no legal encumbrance." She paused for exactly 1 second. "There never was." Price looked at the dismissal notice. He looked at the certified clarification beside it, which she had also brought, which he had already received a copy of, but which she wanted him to see again in this specific context. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man who is making a series of small adjustments to how he understood the last 30 days. "I'll need to verify the drafts," he said. "Of course," she said. "I'll wait." He was gone for 11 minutes. She sat in his office with Jonas, and they did not speak. There was nothing to say that the moment didn't already contain. She looked at the wall behind his desk. A map of the county with property lines marked Ravenridge Valley, laid out in the flat two-dimensional language of surveys and boundaries, all the parcels in their respective sizes, the Mercer 43 acres, a small rectangle in the upper east quadrant among much larger holdings. She could find Rusk's holdings on that map without looking hard. They were large. They were adjacent to 3 other operations he'd expanded into over the years. They were, she thought, the visual language of what happened when you had capital and time and relationships. Things spread in the direction of your attention, and everything nearby became part of your shape. She looked at her own rectangle on the map. Small, rocky. 43 acres of hillside that every cattleman in the valley had told the previous owners wasn't worth farming. Price came back with a receipt already written and a junior employee behind him who carried the stamped account book. He sat down, looked at the receipt, and signed it. "The note is paid in full," he said. He had the controlled expression of a man who is professionally required to be pleasant in situations he finds unpleasant, and he was managing it adequately. "The acceleration notice is withdrawn as of today." She took the receipt. She read it completely before she put it in the cedar box, because she was not going to walk out of this building and discover that something was wrong with the language. Everything was right. She placed it carefully on top of the other documents and closed the box. "I have one more thing to discuss," she said. He waited, with the patient expression of a man who had just been paid and was therefore feeling marginally more generous than he'd been feeling 5 minutes ago. She took the production summary from the cedar box. She had written it cleanly, with the ledger columns reproduced in full, and the buyer relationships documented, and the delivery schedule for the next 3 months outlined, and the revenue projection through spring, based on current herd capacity and the expansion trajectory if the herd grew at the rate it had been growing. She had included, at the bottom, a single number, the loan amount she was requesting, with a repayment schedule built on the conservative projection, not the optimistic one. She placed it on his desk. "I'd like to discuss an expansion loan," she said. He looked at the document. He looked at her. She let him read it. She did not feel the silence while he read, because the document was the argument, and any word she added would only dilute it. Price was a man who thought in numbers, and the numbers were there, doing exactly what they needed to do. He looked up from the document after 2 minutes. Your buyer relationships, he said. These are all documented, signed arrangements? Tobias Creed standing order arrangement can be verified by contacting Creed directly. Aldwick provisions, direct purchase arrangement with signed order forms. I have copies. Prentice Freight, one completed transaction with a standing inquiry for January. She had anticipated every question he might ask. She had been preparing the answers for 6 weeks. My production records go back to the first batch in August. Every figure in that document is verifiable against the logbook. He looked at the numbers again. She watched him find the production trajectory line, the upward curve of weekly milk volume, the corresponding increase in batch size, the projection for what the herd could produce by the following spring if given the resources to expand. It was not a dramatic projection. She had deliberately built it conservatively because she understood that what a banker trusted was not ambition, but restraint. The expansion you're describing, he said slowly, additional breeding stock, expanded aging capacity, additional pasture fencing, what does that do to your per-wheel cost? She had the calculation. She gave it to him. He checked it against something in his own head and came out approximately where she was, and she could see him deciding whether the margin was sufficient. It was sufficient. The numbers said so. She had made sure the numbers said so before she walked in here. I'd need a production review in 6 months, he said. If the volume targets aren't tracking with the projections, then we discuss adjustments, she said. I'm not asking for money. I'm not confident I can repay on the schedule I've given you. If the situation changes, I'll tell you before you ask. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not warm. He was not a warm man, but something more specific than the professional neutrality he'd been maintaining since she walked in. Something that might have been, in a different person, a kind of reassessment. I'll need to process this formally, he said. Standard review, 3 to 5 days. That's fine, she said. She stood up. Jonas stood up behind her. She picked up the cedar box and extended her hand across the desk, and Price shook it with the slightly startled expression of a man who had expected a different ending to this morning and was recalibrating in real time. She walked out of Harlan Price's bank with the paid receipt in the cedar box and Jonas beside her, and the cold December air hitting her face, and the main road of Ravenridge opening up in front of her under a gray winter sky. Jonas said nothing for half a block. Then, "You asked for the loan." "Yes." "Right there, after paying the note." "That's when he was most likely to listen," she said. "He'd just been paid in full by someone he expected to lose the property, and I put the numbers in front of him before he had time to reframe it." Jonas walked beside her for a few more steps. "Did he look surprised?" "A little." "Good," Jonas said. She almost smiled. They had not been on the main road of Ravenridge together for any social reason in months. The town went about its December business around them. The feed merchant's wagon at the loading dock, 2 women talking at the door of the dry goods, a group of men outside the Ravenridge Inn. She didn't know who saw them. She didn't particularly care. She was not walking this road to make a point. She was walking it because it was the way back to the wagon. But she noticed that nobody laughed. The loan approval came 4 days later, not 5. Cordell sent a separate notification the same week that Beale's challenge had been formally closed in the county record and no further action was pending. Elowen filed both documents in the cedar box and started planning what the expansion looked like in practical terms. Which animals to acquire first, how many additional does. The fencing priority order. What additional aging capacity she could build in the root cellar before the production increase outgrew the current shelving. She made a list. Not a wish list. A sequenced operational plan with costs and timelines attached to each step. Then she rode up to see Creddy. The old man was in better shape than she'd expected for early winter. He'd put on some weight since September, which was a good sign, and he had a fire going that made the small house feel genuinely warm. He had a wheel of his own current production on the table, a 7-week wheel that looked, she thought, very similar to her own. She told him what had happened, all of it, the auction, the herd, the cheese, Tobias, Aldwick, Prentice, Rusk, the bank. She told it quickly and without editorializing, the same way she wrote in the logbook, just the facts in order, because Creddy was a man who would draw his own conclusions and didn't need her to tell him what to think about them. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he picked up his coffee cup and looked at her over the rim of it. "The gray doe," he said, "the one with the eye." "Recovered, back to full production." He nodded slowly. "Good animal." The best I have, she said. How many do you want to get to? He said. Eventually. What's the number you're building toward? She had thought about this. She had been thinking about it for weeks. In the space between everything else, the way you think about the shape of something you're building before the materials are all in place. 80 animals, she said. Healthy breeding herd, 60 producing does. At that scale, with the aging capacity I'm planning, I can supply Tobias's full Callaway route and Aldwick's standing order and still have enough to take on one more buyer. That's 4 or 5 years of careful work, Creddy said. I know. You're 29 years old. I know that too. He made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He picked up a knife and cut 2 wedges from his 7-week wheel and slid one across the table to her. She ate it. It was good. Not as good as her 11-week wheel, but good in the way of something made by a man who had been paying careful attention for 60 years. You learned faster than I expected, he said. I had to, she said. Most people use that as an excuse to cut corners, he said. You used it to go deeper. That's different. He looked at his own wedge of cheese for a moment. The valley's going to come around. They always do when there's money in it. He paused. That's not a compliment to the valley. That's just how it goes. She drove home in the early afternoon with the pale winter light coming sideways across the ridge, and the valley laid out below her in its gray-brown December colors, the bare trees and the frost-bleached grass, and the smoke from chimneys scattered across the distance. She could see the Mercer property from the upper road if she looked at the right angle. The barn, the pasture fence, the dark rectangle of the upper slope where the herd was working. She stopped the wagon for a moment and looked at it. 43 acres of rocky hillside, worthless land by the consensus of everyone who had evaluated it by the standard of what it couldn't do. She had spent 4 months asking what it could do, and she had an answer now that was documented in a logbook and supported by signed orders and confirmed by a bank loan and written in the accounts of buyers in Callaway and on a freight captain's southern route, and in the specific, irreplaceable fact that not one of the 39 animals she'd bought for $3 had died on her watch. She put the wagon back in motion. At the bottom of the hill, where the lower pasture track met the main road, she passed a rider going the other direction. She didn't recognize him until he was almost alongside her. One of the hands from Rusk's operation, a young man she'd seen at the feed store a few times. He looked at her as they passed. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. She kept going. There would be time for whatever came next. There would be time for the expansion and the additional animals and the 60 producing does and the broader delivery routes that were still only lines on a page. There would be time to see what Bramwell Rusk decided to do when a man of his resources and his temperament ran out of angles on a 29-year-old woman with a goat herd and a root cellar full of cheese. But right now, she had a herd to check and a cellar to monitor, and a batch coming due for turning, and a gray doe with a cloudy eye who had earned, Elowen thought, whatever extra care an animal could be given. And Jonas would be finishing the afternoon fence work about now. And she had promised herself she would tell him the full numbers tonight, the real margin, the 4 days, all of it. Because he deserved to know, and because the crisis was past, and because some kinds of honesty were only possible once the thing you'd been protecting was safe. She pulled into the yard. The herd was coming down from the upper slope for the evening, their bells making the small, irregular music she knew better now than almost any other sound in her life. The gray doe was at the front of the group, moving with the easy authority of an animal that had decided its place in the order of things. Elowen unhitched the horse and led her to the barn and filled her water and then stood for a moment in the barn doorway with the cold coming on and the herd settling around her and the cedar box under her arm with the paid receipt inside it. She thought about Crady's question. What's the number you're building toward? 80 animals, 60 producing does, 4 or 5 years of careful work. She was 29 years old. She had time. She had the herd and the land and the logbook and the buyers and the loan and the certain, specific, hard-won knowledge of how to make something from what other people had decided was worthless. She went inside to start dinner and to wait for Jonas and to write the day's figures in the logbook, because the record didn't stop because a hard chapter ended, and there was still everything that came next. She told Jonas the full numbers that night, all of it, the 4-day margin, the Grey Doe's production loss, and what it had cost the timeline, the Tobias advance and why she'd needed it, the way the legal fee had compressed everything down to something she'd been managing alone for the final 2 weeks, while telling him enough, but not everything. She laid it out at the kitchen table after dinner with the logbook open between them and walked him through each calculation, each adjustment, each moment where the arithmetic had shifted and she'd recalculated without telling him the new number. He listened the way he always listened to complicated things, without interrupting, without the visible anxiety she sometimes saw in men who needed to respond to information before they'd fully absorbed it. He let her finish. Then he sat with it for a moment. 4 days, he said. Yes. And you didn't tell me. No. He looked at the logbook, not at her. Because you didn't want me to worry. Because I thought I could manage it. And I did manage it. And I didn't have the capacity to manage it, and also manage your reaction to it. She said it plainly, without apology but also without defensiveness. It was the truth, and he deserved the truth, even the uncomfortable version. That was probably wrong, I'm telling you now. He was quiet for a long moment. The fire had burned down to coals and the kitchen was getting colder at the edges, but neither of them moved to add wood. I want you to tell me, he said finally. Next time. Even if I worry. Even if my worrying is useless to you. He paused. Especially then. Because you carrying it alone is worse than me worrying. She looked at him. He meant it. She could see that he meant it in the specific way you can see when someone has arrived at a position through genuine thought, rather than just saying the thing that sounds right. He had been thinking about this, about what it meant to be the person next to someone who had learned to carry everything alone, and about whether that was something he'd made necessary by not being the kind of partner who could hold weight without dropping it. All right, she said. All right, he repeated. They sat together a little longer in the cooling kitchen, not talking, the logbook open between them, with its columns of figures and its months of careful record. And it was not a romantic moment in any conventional sense. It was something more durable than that. It was two people who had been through something genuinely hard deciding, without ceremony, to be more honest with each other going forward. She added wood to the fire before they went to bed. The expansion began in January. Not dramatically. Nothing about what Elowen built had ever been dramatic at the beginning. It started with 6 additional does from a farm 3 valleys over, animals that a widower named Sutter was selling because his health had declined to the point where he could no longer manage the herd. Elowen had heard about Sutter from Tobias, who heard about everything, and she'd driven out to see the animals herself before committing. They were in reasonable condition, not as thin as the auction goats had been. Not a crisis situation, just an older man who'd been doing less than the herd needed for the past season. She paid fair price, which was not the same as paying high price, and Sutter seemed to appreciate being dealt with directly, and without the kind of negotiation theatrics that some buyers used when they sensed a seller's desperation. She brought the 6 does home and quarantined them from the main herd for 2 weeks, per the protocol she'd developed after the gray doe's illness in November, and used the quarantine period to assess them individually. 3 were strong producers, 2 were average. One was younger than Sutter had described, barely past her first season, which meant her production potential was unknown, but her breeding value was good. She recorded all of this in the logbook. The additional fencing Jonas had been working on since December was ready by the time the quarantine ended. He'd done it in sections, fitting it between the weather and the other work, and it wasn't elegant. There were corners where the post angles weren't quite what they should be, and stretches where the wire tension varied more than she'd have liked. But it held, and it enclosed the additional pasture acreage she needed to support the expanded herd without overgrazing the hillside. Functional was what they had the resources for. Functional was enough. By March, the herd was producing at a volume she hadn't projected until April. She recalculated the expansion timeline, moved several targets forward by 6 weeks, did not celebrate this, simply updated the plan, and kept moving. The Ravenridge Valley in early spring was a specific kind of difficult. The roads were mud from snowmelt, which complicated deliveries, which complicated payment timing, which complicated everything downstream. She'd planned for this, and it was still harder than the plan accounted for, because mud in theory and mud in practice were different problems. 2 of Tobias's delivery wagons ran late by a combined 9 days across February and March. She absorbed the delay by adjusting the aging schedule, holding wheels an extra week before the delivery window, which meant the buyers received a slightly more developed product than the standard, which meant 2 of them wrote to Tobias asking specifically for the extended age wheel going forward. She charged more for it. Tobias told her she could, and she believed him because he had no commercial incentive to undervalue her product. The additional per-wheel revenue on the extended age wheels added up across the spring to an amount that partially offset the payment delays from the mud season, and she noted this in the logbook with the particular attention she gave to unexpected discoveries that changed the calculation in a useful direction. What she was learning, what the logbook was teaching her, if you read it as a whole rather than as individual entries, was that the operation was developing its own intelligence. Not hers, exactly. Not something she'd designed, but something that emerged from the interaction between her decisions and the specific character of this land and these animals and this market, a kind of accumulated wisdom that was larger than any single thing she'd figured out and that she was still learning to read. She shared some of this with Creedy in April when she rode up to return the notes he'd lent her at the beginning, the folded paper with the cramped handwriting that had been the foundation of everything she'd built. She'd kept them for 8 months. She'd read them so many times the paper was soft at the folds. "Keep them," he said. "They're yours." "I've got 60 years of them in my head," he said. "You need the paper." She kept the paper. Freddie was quieter than usual that April afternoon. He moved around his small house with the careful economy of an older man who was managing something he didn't want to name directly, and she didn't press him on it because it was not her place. And because she understood, in the way you understand things about people who have taught you something important, that some things needed to be carried the way he chose to carry them. She told him about the additional does and the extended age wheel discovery, and the payment timing issue in the mud season, and the way the market was beginning to specifically request Mercer product by name. He listened with the same quality of attention he'd given to everything she'd ever told him. Complete, unhurried, the attention of a man who understood that listening well was its own form of skill. "Ravenridge is talking about you," he said when she'd finished. "I know. Different than they were." "Yes." He looked out his window at the ridge. "That'll be its own problem eventually," he said. "When people decide they want a piece of something, they start rewriting the story of how it happened. Make it simpler than it was. Take out the hard parts." He paused. "Don't let them take out the hard parts. The hard parts are what it actually is." She thought about that for a long time on the drive home. The hard parts were what it actually was. The gray dough in the dirt and the failed first batch, and the 4-day margin, and the mud season payment delays, and the nights at the kitchen table with the logbook and the arithmetic that never came out the way she'd hoped on the first pass. Those were not the background to the story, those were the story. And she had no intention of letting anyone flatten them into something more comfortable than they'd actually been. Bramwell Russ came to the farm in May. She had expected him to come eventually. She had not expected him to come alone. He rode up the track on a Tuesday afternoon without sending word ahead, which was either arrogance or an acknowledgement that he couldn't be certain she'd receive him if he gave her the choice. She was in the pasture checking on the youngest doe's feeding pattern when she saw him coming up the hill, and she watched him come without moving toward him or away, because she had learned, in the auction yard, and in Tobias's office, and in Price's bank, and in every other room where the balance of power had not been in her favor, that the instinct to meet someone on their terms was worth resisting until you'd assessed the situation clearly. He dismounted at the fence and tied his horse and stood there, which was also not what she'd expected. He was not a man who typically waited. He looked slightly less large than she remembered, which was probably not a physical change so much as a shift in her own frame of reference. She walked over. Up close, Bramwell Rusk looked like a man who had spent the winter losing something. Not dramatically. Not in any way he would have admitted, but in the specific way that capable men look when a situation has not resolved the way their capabilities usually ensured, and they are in the process of renegotiating something with themselves about what that means. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. "Mr. Rusk," she said. He looked at the herd on the upper slope. He looked at the barn and the fence line and the general condition of a property that looked, she knew, considerably different than it had looked the previous summer. Then he looked at her. "Your operation is doing well," he said. It was not a question. "It is," she said. He was quiet for a moment. She did not fill the silence. She had learned that the person who fills a silence is usually the person who is more anxious about what it contains, and she was not anxious about this one. "I've been looking at goats," he said. She waited. "My cattle operation had a difficult winter. Drought conditions hit the main pasture harder than I projected. I've been talking to some people about diversifying." He paused. I wanted to come and see your setup directly before I made any decisions. What kind of decisions? She said. I want to start a dairy goat herd. On the east acreage, the rocky section along the creek that I've been leaving fallow because cattle don't do well there. He said it with the particular flatness of a man who is saying something he would have found unthinkable a year ago and is not going to comment on that directly. I'd want to buy breeding stock from you, and I'd want to know more about the production process. She looked at him steadily. Why come to me specifically? He met her eyes. Because you're the only person in this valley who's actually done it. She gave that the moment it deserved. Not because she needed to savor it, she had long since stopped needing anything from Bramwell Rusk's acknowledgement, but because it was a real thing he'd said, and real things deserved not to be rushed past. There are conditions, she said. I expected there would be. The bank action against our property, she said. The acceleration letter Price sent at your instigation. I want that formally removed from our credit record with the bank. Not just the acceleration notice. The underlying notation that suggested our collateral was encumbered. It needs to come out of the record cleanly, with a letter from Price's office acknowledging the encumbrance was unfounded. He was quiet, not resistant, just processing, in the way of a man who had expected terms and was now measuring these specific ones against whatever he'd calculated they might cost him. That requires Price's cooperation, he said. You got his cooperation in November, she said. You can get it again. Another pause. What else? Full market price on the breeding stock. No negotiation, no volume discount. If you want quality animals from this herd, you pay what the market says they're worth. She paused. And the knowledge you're asking for, the production process, the aging protocol, the herd management, that's a consulting arrangement, not a favor. I'll name a rate and you'll pay it or you won't. He looked at her for a long moment. She had the impression of a man conducting an internal accounting of some kind, not just the commercial terms, but something larger, something about what this moment cost him in a currency that wasn't money. Those terms are acceptable, he said. Then we have an arrangement, she said. She shook his hand, firm, brief, businesslike. His grip was what she'd expected. A man who had shaken hands as a power move for decades and still couldn't entirely let go of the habit, even when the power dynamics had shifted. I'll contact Price this week, he said. I'll expect to see the letter within 30 days, she said. When I have it, we can begin. He mounted his horse and rode back down the track, and she stood at the fence and watched him go and felt, not triumph. Not the kind of feeling that gets described as triumph in the stories people tell afterward. What she felt was closer to clarity, the specific, plain satisfaction of a situation being fully resolved, not emotionally resolved, not in the sense of everything being made right, because some things that had happened could not be made right, but practically resolved, operationally resolved. The last piece of the Rusk problem finding its place. She went back to check on the youngest doe. Price's letter arrived in 22 days, not 30. Whether that reflected Rusk's urgency or simply Price's desire to have the matter behind him, she didn't know and didn't need to know. The letter said what it needed to say. She filed it in the cedar box. She started working with Rusk in June. It was, she had to admit, a genuinely strange thing. Not uncomfortable. She did not carry the past into the working relationship because she had no use for it there, and she suspected Rusk, whatever his personal feelings about the situation, was too commercially rational to let sentiment complicate something he was paying her to teach him. But strange, in the way that the complete reversal of a power dynamic is always strange even when you've prepared for it. She took him through everything, not quickly, not performing patience she didn't feel, just methodically. The same way she'd taught Jonas, the same way she'd learned from Creddy. The fencing requirements and why. The feeding patterns and what to watch for. The sanitation protocol in the milk room and why cutting corners there cost you in the batch, every time, without exception. The separation process and the temperature ranges that mattered, and the specific signs that told you a batch was going wrong before it was too late to adjust. Rusk was a faster learner than she'd expected. That was the honest assessment, and she made it honestly in her own head without letting it change anything about the terms or the rate or the professional distance she maintained throughout. He asked good questions. Not the questions of a man performing interest, but the questions of someone who is actually trying to understand a system rather than just acquire surface familiarity with it. He'd built a successful cattle operation over 20 years. He knew how to learn about animals. The species was different. The underlying discipline of attention was something he already had. She watched him make mistakes and corrected them without ceremony, and watched him not make the same mistake twice, which was, she had learned, the most useful thing you could say about anyone learning anything. By midsummer, he had 6 does on the East Acreage eating brush that had been growing unchecked for years. She visited once to check his setup and gave him 4 notes on what needed adjustment, and left without having a conversation about anything other than the animals and the operation. It was a professional relationship. It was going to stay a professional relationship, which was what she wanted, and what she thought Rusk probably preferred too. There are ways that history between people shapes what is possible between them, and the history between Elowen Mercer and Bramwell Rusk had a specific shape that made certain things impossible: friendship, warmth, the kind of easy collaboration that exists between people who have never had reason to distrust each other. They both knew this, and neither of them needed to say it. What was possible was what they had: a transaction in which she was paid fairly for something she knew and he did not, and in which both parties understood clearly what the arrangement was and was not. It was enough. The Ravenridge Territorial Agricultural Exhibition was held in September, the way it was every year. A 3-day event on the exhibition grounds at the edge of town, with livestock judging and produce displays in the agricultural competition that the valley took seriously enough to argue about for weeks beforehand. Elowen had never entered before. She had been to the exhibition as a spectator in previous years, had watched the judging from the edge of crowds that sometimes parted for her and sometimes didn't, and had noted the results with the detached interest of someone who was not yet in the game being played. She entered 4 wheels. Not because she needed the validation. She was clear with herself about this before she submitted the entry forms. The operation did not require a prize ribbon to be real. The logbook was full. The buyers were paying. The loan was being repaid on schedule. Creddy's notes were folded in the cedar box next to the bank receipt, and the letter from Price's office, and the signed orders from Tobias and Aldwick and Prentice. The validation was already there, in the form of everything that had actually happened. She entered because the exhibition was where the valley made its formal assessments, where it looked at what had been produced and decided what it valued. And she had spent enough time being dismissed by this valley's assessments that she wanted to put her work in front of those assessments directly, not defiantly. Not to prove anyone wrong exactly, just to put it there, to let it be seen. She entered a 6-week wheel, an 8-week wheel, a 10-week wheel, and the 14-week wheel she'd been aging since June, the longest cure she'd attempted, held at careful temperature in the root cellar that Jonas had expanded twice now, watched and turned and noted in the logbook, with an attention that had become, over the past year, something she didn't have to think about. It was simply what she did, the same way breathing was what she did. The record and the attention and the care, they were not discipline anymore. They were character. The 14-week wheel was the best thing she'd made. She knew this without false modesty and without overstatement, the same way you know the temperature of something you've been monitoring closely. It was hard and complex and had a depth of flavor that the earlier wheels had pointed toward without fully arriving at. The rind was deep amber. The interior was pale and close-grained, and when you pressed it with a knife, it yielded with the specific resistance of something that had been developing for a long time and was fully itself. She brought all 4 wheels to the exhibition on the first morning and arranged them on the judging table and left them there and went to look at other people's entries, because she was not going to stand next to her own submission watching people look at it. She walked through the livestock area instead, saw 2 families she recognized from Ravenridge's outer reaches, the Pelham family from the North Valley, the Grady's from the Creek Road. Each of them with goats entered in the livestock judging. Both families had come to her in the spring, tentatively, through mutual acquaintances, asking questions about whether their land might support a small dairy herd. She had answered their questions without reserve, the same way Creddy had answered hers, because she understood from direct experience that information shared was not advantage lost. The Pelhams had 3 does. The Grady's had 5. Neither operation was going to challenge her production anytime soon, but that was not the point. The point was that rocky hillside land in Ravenridge Valley was being worked in a way it hadn't been before, and she was part of why. Margaret Pelham saw her coming and walked over. She was in her mid-40s, a serious woman who had asked good questions in the spring and had clearly been doing her own research between then and now. Our first milk batch was last month, Margaret said, without preamble. How did it go? Elowen said. The separation was off the first time, second time better. I've got 3 wheels in the cellar at 4 weeks. She paused. I used your press timing from the notes you gave me. And? The rind is forming the way you described. I think they're going to be right. She paused again, with the look of someone who is about to say something they've been calculating whether to say. Thank you. For the time you gave us in the spring. You didn't have to. Elowen looked at her. Creddy didn't have to give me his time either, she said. Somebody gave me what I needed when I needed it. Passing it forward is the only way that makes sense. Margaret nodded, with the slightly compressed expression of someone who understands something that is both simple and not easy. Elowen went back to the exhibition hall for the judging. The cheese judging at the Ravenridge exhibition was taken seriously in the specific, serious way that people in hard country took anything that affected their food supply. The judge was an older woman named Pruitt, who had run a dairy operation in a neighboring county for 30 years before retiring, and who was known for assessments that were direct to the point of discomfort and completely unaffected by who had entered what. Elowen had inquired about Pruitt before entering and been reassured by everything she'd heard because she wanted the assessment to be real or she didn't want it at all. She stood at the back of the hall with Jonas while Pruitt worked through the entries. There were 11 total, various hard and soft cheeses from producers across the region, some of them operations she recognized and some she didn't. Pruitt worked systematically, cutting samples, tasting each one with the unhurried attention of someone who had tasted a great many things and knew exactly what she was looking for. She reached the Mercer wheels. Elowen watched her work through the 6-week and the 8-week without any visible change in expression. At the 10-week wheel, Pruitt paused slightly longer. Then she reached the 14-week wheel and cut into it and held the wedge up for a moment before tasting it, and Elowen could see even from the back of the room that this was a person responding to something. Pruitt wrote something in her notes. The award announcements came after the judging period. They were given by the exhibition committee chairman, a portly man named Gafferty, who read results from a sheet with the delivery of someone who was aware that some people in the room were going to be pleased and some were not. Third prize went to a hard cow's milk wheel from an operation in the next county. Second prize went to a fresh soft cheese that drew appreciative murmurs from the front rows. First prize, hard-aged category, Gafferty read, with the slight pause of a man about to say a name that surprised him. Goes to the 14-week aged goat wheel, Mercer operation, Ravenridge Valley. It was not a loud room. There was applause, genuine, not polite. The difference is always audible. And there were some voices she recognized among the applauding ones, and some she didn't. She walked forward to collect the ribbon and the small prize envelope and shook Gafferty's hand and turned to face the room. Bramwell Rusk was standing near the left wall. She hadn't noticed him come in. He was applauding, not with any particular expression on his face, not warmly, not performing anything. Just a man clapping his hands because the situation called for it, and he had made a decision to be present in it honestly. She looked at him for exactly a moment and then looked at the rest of the room. Because the rest of the room was what mattered. Because the rest of the room was the valley she lived in, and the valley she was part of. And the valley that had laughed at her a year ago in an auction yard on a summer morning that felt very far from where she was standing now. Nobody was laughing. She walked back to Jonas. He looked at the ribbon and then at her face, and he said, very quietly, I knew that wheel was going to win. You tasted it in June, she said. You said it tasted like aged leather. Good leather, he said. I said good leather. She almost laughed. She came close enough to it that the people nearest them gave her a curious look. Outside, afterward, standing in the September afternoon with the exhibition noise behind them and the ribbon in her hand and the envelope with the prize money in her coat pocket, Jonas stood beside her and didn't try to fill the moment with anything. He was getting better at that, at understanding which moments wanted language and which ones simply wanted two people standing next to each other acknowledging what had happened. It had taken almost a year of her not needing him to have the right words before he'd started to trust that his presence was sometimes enough. She thought it had probably taken her not saying it directly for it to settle in at the depth where it would hold. They walked back through the exhibition grounds toward the wagon. She saw the Gradys with their livestock ribbons. Saw Margaret Pelham, in conversation with another woman who had goats in the livestock show, saw Tobias Creed at the edge of the freight display talking to a buyer she didn't recognize. Tobias caught her eye across the distance and gave her a nod that was small and precise and meant exactly what it appeared to mean. Well done. Carry on. This changes nothing about the commercial relationship, but is noted. She nodded back. In October, she got a letter from Prentice. He wanted to double his order for the spring route. He'd had 2 customers along the Southern Freight Road ask specifically for the Mercer wheel after tasting it in transit, which was a sentence she read twice because it confirmed something she'd been hoping but hadn't been certain of. The product was traveling, in both the literal and commercial sense, beyond the range she could directly manage. She wrote back confirming the double order and updating the price slightly upward. Not dramatically, not in a way that strained the relationship, but to reflect the increased demand and the expanded production she'd had to build in order to meet it. She had learned from watching Tobias that the worst thing a producer could do was hold their price flat in the face of rising demand, because it sent the wrong signal about value and it left money in the room that should be going into the operation. Prentice wrote back accepting the new price without argument, which told her she'd pitched it right. The herd was at 51 animals by October, not 80 yet. She had updated the timeline. The original 4 to 5 year projection was running roughly on schedule, neither dramatically ahead nor significantly behind. She had stopped wanting it to be ahead. There was a quality to things built at the right pace that things built too fast didn't have, a structural integrity that came from each expansion being fully absorbed before the next one was attempted. And she had seen enough operations fail from overextension to know that sustainable was more valuable than fast. She said something like this to the Gradys when she visited them in October to check on their first proper cheese batch. They were 5 months into the operation, making the kinds of mistakes she'd made in months 2 and 3, and the mistakes were not disasters. They were the normal cost of learning something that couldn't be learned except by doing it. "How long until we're producing what you're producing?" Daniel Grady asked, with the slight anxiety of a man who had committed to a change and was now calibrating how long it would take to pay off. "Depends on your herd quality and how fast you resolve what's off in your press timing," she said. 2 years before you're at a production level worth a standing freight arrangement. Maybe 18 months if everything breaks right." She paused. "Don't try to go faster than that. The market will still be there. Your reputation for consistency is worth more than moving product early." He accepted this with the look of a man who wasn't entirely satisfied by the timeline, but understood the reasoning. She recognized that look. She'd worn it herself, back in the early months when every calculation seemed to land a few months short of where she needed it to be. The following month, she went back to see Creddy. It was November, almost exactly a year from the morning she'd read Price's acceleration letter at the kitchen table with the cold coming in through the gaps in the north wall. The north wall was repaired now. Had been since December. She'd almost forgotten what it felt like to sit in that kitchen with the cold finding its way through. Creddy was inside, which was not unusual for November, but he was in his chair rather than at his workbench, which was. He looked smaller than she remembered. Not ill, exactly, he told her, with the specific firmness of a man declining sympathy, that he was fine, but reduced in the way that older people sometimes are at the start of winter, as if the cold took something, the warmth would return. She sat across from him and told him about the exhibition and the Prentice order and the Grady and Pelham operations and what they were learning. She told him about Rusk's 6 does on the East Acreage and what they were producing. She told him about the 14-week wheel and what Prewitt had written in her notes, which Gafferty had let her read afterward. Depth and complexity, appropriate to extended aging, exceptional rind integrity, evidence of careful temperature management throughout, which was not poetry. It was exactly what she'd been working toward, described precisely. Creddy listened to all of it with his eyes half closed in the way of an old man who is listening more deeply than he appears to be. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The gray doe," he said. "Still the best in the herd," she said. "I bred her in the spring. She's due in January. I'm expecting at least 1 strong female from the litter." "Probably 2, he said. "Animal that productive usually throws productive offspring. That's what I'm counting on." He opened his eyes fully and looked at her with the expression she'd come to know as his most direct one, the look that meant he was going to say something he thought was true and wasn't going to soften it. "You built something real," he said. "Not just the operation, the way you went about it." He paused. That's harder to teach than the cheese. She sat with that. You taught me most of what matters, she said. I gave you information, he said. That's different. Information doesn't turn into anything without the person it's given to. He looked at his hands, which were the hands of a man who had worked outdoors for 60 years, and showed it. I gave Sutter the same notes I gave you, 30 years ago. He sold those duds to you last January. She hadn't known that. She looked at him. Some people see what the information points toward, he said. Some people see a piece of paper. He settled back in his chair. You saw where it pointed. She drove home in the early dark with that sitting with her, not as a compliment. She had moved past needing Creddy's approval sometime in the spring, moved past needing anyone's approval, really, because the operation had become its own argument. And arguments that stood on their own didn't require external validation to remain standing, but as something more useful. As an observation about how the same thing could look entirely different depending on the person looking at it, and how that difference was not about intelligence or luck or even hard work, exactly, but about willingness. Willingness to look at a dying herd in a bad pen and ask what they were actually good for. Willingness to look at a rocky hillside and ask what it actually needed. Willingness to look at a failed cheese batch and write down everything that had gone wrong rather than setting the logbook aside. She had been willing. That was all. It was not a small thing, but it was not a complicated one. At the Mercer farm in December, the root cellar held rows of aging wheels on cedar shelves that ran the length of the extended walls. Jonas's work, careful if not elegant, the walls he'd measured and built in sections over the course of the year. The newest batch still white and soft-rinded, the middle ones going gold, the oldest approaching the deep amber she'd come to associate with the product at its best. The herd was 51 strong, browsing the upper slope in the December light. The gray doe was near the top of the hill with the rest of the senior does, her cloudy eye catching the winter sun the way it always did, that particular silver white that had worried Elowen once and now just looked like her. The banknote was gone. The loan was being repaid on schedule. The cedar box under the kitchen shelf held the paid receipt and the price letter and the dismissal notice and Crady's folded notes and the exhibition ribbon, accumulated in the order they'd arrived, each one a marker of something that had cost what it cost and been worth what it was worth. Elowen sat at the kitchen table after the morning milking and opened the logbook to a fresh page and wrote the date at the top. Under it, she wrote the daily figures. Under those, she wrote the projection for the next 3 months, which she could do with considerably more confidence now than she could have a year ago, because the operation had a year of actual data behind it rather than just extrapolation. At the bottom of the projection column, in the margin where she'd been writing notes to herself since August of the previous year, she wrote one sentence. She looked at it for a moment. Then she closed the logbook and carried it back to the cellar shelf where it lived between the aging wheels, and she went outside to start the afternoon work. Jonas was at the fence. The December air was cold and specific and smelled like frost and hay and the particular mineral quality of the hillside in winter. The valley spread below the property in its gray-brown December colors, the same colors it had been last December, the same valley it had always been, hard and dry and beautiful in a spare way, and full of people doing their best with what they had. She walked up the hill toward the upper pasture to check on the herd. The gray doe looked up when she came through the gate. Just for a moment, the quick assessing attention of an animal that has learned to read the human who feeds it, and then went back to the brush she'd been working on, because the brush was there, and she was a goat, and that was what she was for. Elowen stood on the hillside and watched her herd for a while. Then she went back to work. The sentence she'd written in the logbook margin that morning said, "Worth is discovered by those willing to see what others dismiss." Not wisdom she'd been handed, not something anyone had told her, something she had learned.